Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. We lived in a small town in Ohio Amish country, the kind of place where the most exciting thing to do on a Friday night was drive around aimlessly or sit in a Walmart parking lot. In high school, boredom had a way of making us reckless, always looking for something new, something thrilling, something that made us feel like we weren't just wasting our years in the middle of nowhere. That's how we ended up in those woods that night, walking toward a house that none of us had any business going near. There were 10 of us, a big enough group to feel confident, but small enough that we knew each other well. We had spent the night at my buddy's place watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was probably the dumbest possible choice of movie considering what we were about to do. The plan came up in the middle of the movie, someone mentioning the old abandoned house deep in the woods. My buddy swore it had been there for decades, left to rot in the middle of nowhere. No driveway leading up to it, just trees, brush, and an eerie silence that made the place seem forgotten. It wasn't the first time we'd gone looking for abandoned places, but something about this one felt different. It was late when we finally headed out, close to midnight, our cars parked on a gravel road that barely saw any traffic. The air was cool, not cold, but enough that you could see your breath when you exhaled. The only sounds were crickets and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the trees. We had to cross a shallow river to get to the house, our shoes slipping on the smooth, wet stones as we made our way through. The water was ice cold, soaking through our socks, but we laughed it off, the rush of excitement keeping us from thinking too much about what we were doing. We walked for about a mile, our flashlights bobbing in the dark as we picked our way through the woods. The further we went, the quieter everything seemed to get, as if even the wildlife knew to stay away. That was the first thing that unsettled me, how dead the woods felt. No rustling in the underbrush, no insects humming in the trees, just the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional murmur of someone whispering to the person next to them. Then we saw it. The house was huge, much bigger than I had expected. A turn-of-the-century mansion, or what was left of one. The second floor had collapsed onto the first, making it impossible to go inside. But even from the outside, it was clear this place had been abandoned for a long time. Vines crawled up the sides. The windows were either shattered or missing entirely, and the roof sagged in a way that made the whole structure look like it was barely holding itself together. There was no driveway, no sign that this house had ever been connected to the rest of the world. It just sat there, swallowed by the woods, waiting. We walked the perimeter, shining our lights over the warped wood and peeling paint. Someone kicked at a loose board, and the sound echoed through the empty structure, making a few of the girls jump. I had my shotgun slung over my shoulder, more as a joke than anything else, but I was starting to feel like it might not be the worst thing to have on me. Something about this place felt wrong, and I could tell I wasn't the only one who felt it. Then one of the guys called us over. He had found writing on one of the walls, long paragraphs of what looked like rambling nonsense, scrawled in thick, uneven letters. We leaned in, reading over the faded words, trying to make sense of it. Some of it sounded like diary entries, someone talking about being watched, about hearing voices at night, about the things under the floor. Then we got to the bottom. There, in a neat row, were 10 sets of initials. 10. We froze. No one said anything, but we all started counting in our heads, glancing at each other, our breath coming a little faster. There were 10 of us in the group. That was enough for some of the girls to say they were done. They wanted to leave, and I didn't blame them. But before we could turn back, another shout came from the other side of the house. "Hey, I found something." We all ran over, our flashlights swinging wildly in the dark. One of the guys was standing in front of a first-floor window, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. He pointed his flashlight through the broken glass, and we all leaned in to look. Hanging from the ceiling, tied to a thick rope, was a wedding dress. A massive bloodstain covered the front. The sight of it sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. It was too deliberate, too staged. Whoever had been here had wanted someone to find it. We backed away from the window, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. Then I felt it, a shift beneath my feet. A sudden give, like the earth itself had lost its stability. The next thing I knew, I was falling. The crash was deafening, the ground giving way beneath 6 of us, sending us tumbling into darkness. I landed hard, the breath knocked from my lungs, dirt and debris raining down from above. My flashlight slipped from my grip, spinning across the floor before coming to a stop against something metal. When I picked it up and shined it around, my stomach clenched. We weren't in a basement. There were no concrete walls, no foundation. Just dirt, rough-hewn and uneven. And the room we had fallen into wasn't empty. Hooks, chains, saws, old, rusted tools were lying neatly on tables and hanging from the walls. Ropes coiled like snakes, some of them still knotted into loops. It looked like a slaughterhouse, but the tools weren't for animals. My buddy was already scrambling to pull us out, his hands reaching down as we clawed our way back up. We didn't take a second look. We didn't check to see if anything else was down there. We just climbed. Everyone got out except for one guy who had landed wrong, his ankle twisted at an awkward angle. Two of the others half carried him, struggling through the woods while the rest of us stayed in a tight formation. I took up the rear, walking backward the whole way, my shotgun raised, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We didn't stop until we were back at the car. The next day, a few of us went back in the daylight. As we pulled onto the gravel road, we saw them, 3 cop cars, their lights off, parked just out of sight from the main road. We pulled up next to them, trying to act casual, but when we rolled down the window and asked what was going on, the answer made my stomach drop. Someone had heard us the night before and called the cops. When they investigated, they found what we already knew, but they also found more. It had been a meth lab and a crime scene. I don't know the details. I don't know what else they found. But I do know this. They never caught the people who had been using that place. And to this day, I wonder what would have happened if we had walked up to that house a few hours earlier. Or worse, if we had never made it out at all. The basement felt warm, the air thick with the heat from the old TV and the hum of the Xbox running for hours. The 4 of us were sprawled across the couch and the floor, locked in an intense round of some shooter game, barely aware of the time. My younger brother was sitting cross-legged, elbows on his knees, gripping his controller too tightly as usual. Spencer and our other friend, Jake, were hunched over, focused on the screen. The only sounds were the clicking of buttons and the occasional deep sigh when one of us lost. I barely noticed Nugget, our golden retriever, pacing near the door to the stairs. I only caught her moving out of the corner of my eye, her tail swishing as she stopped to stare at me. I knew that look. She needed to go out. I sighed, set my controller down, and stood up. "I'll be back," I muttered, though no one was really paying attention. Nugget padded up the stairs behind me, her nails clicking softly against the hardwood as we reached the first floor. The house was silent. It was strange being home alone at night, but not unusual. Our parents had gone to some dinner party a while ago, leaving us to our own devices. They weren't far, 10, maybe 15 minutes away, but the distance didn't matter much. When you were alone in the house at night, it always felt like they were miles away. The foyer was dimly lit by the porch light shining through the windows, casting long shadows across the walls. I made my way to the front door, unlatched the deadbolt, and pulled it open. The cold evening air hit me immediately, sharp against my skin. Nugget trotted out, sniffing at the ground before wandering down the porch steps onto the grass. I stood there for a moment, rubbing my arms, watching her. The street was empty. The houses across from us were dark, most of the neighbors already asleep. Only the distant hum of a car passing on the main road broke the silence. I glanced around out of habit, then stepped back inside, pulling the door shut behind me. The double doors at the front of our house were old, heavy wood. One was always locked in place unless you physically unlatched it from the bottom and top, a hassle no one ever bothered with. The door I had used shut with a solid thump, and I made sure to twist the lock before heading back downstairs. The game had continued without me, Spencer taking my place temporarily. I dropped back onto the couch, picked up my controller, and fell right back into the game. The basement was warm, the artificial glow of the screen the only light in the room. We played in silence, the occasional grunt or sigh breaking through when one of us messed up. Time passed without any of us thinking about it. Then Spencer's voice broke through, casual but slightly puzzled. "Who let Nugget in?" I barely registered it at first. The words didn't click. Then, as if my brain finally caught up, I turned my head. Nugget was curled up on the carpet a few feet away, her tail thumping lazily against the floor. I stared at her. The others were looking around now too, their expressions mirroring my own. No one had gone upstairs. No one had moved. The only door she could have come through was the front door, and I had locked it. I stood up quickly, my chest tightening, and hurried up the stairs. My footsteps felt too loud in the silence of the house. The first thing I noticed as I reached the top was the cold air. It hit me instantly, rushing down the hall. My stomach dropped before I even turned the corner. The front doors were wide open, not cracked, not slightly ajar. Wide open, both of them, gaping like the house itself had opened its mouth. The porch light spilled out onto the lawn, illuminating the empty street beyond. The quiet had never felt so deep. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I stepped forward, swallowing hard. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doors, gripping the edge of one and pulling it shut. It took effort, the weight of it resisting me. I locked it as fast as I could, then grabbed the other and shoved it closed, twisting the deadbolt with stiff fingers. My mind was racing, trying to piece it together. Had I forgotten to lock it? No, I was sure I had. I remembered the solid click of the lock. It wasn't something I would have overlooked. I turned and walked quickly to the garage, pressing the button to lift the door. The light flickered on, revealing the empty space. My parents' car was still gone. They hadn't come home. I swallowed again, my throat dry, and pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed my mom's number. The ringing seemed to stretch forever before she finally answered. I kept my voice low, trying not to sound panicked as I explained what happened. She didn't hesitate. They were coming home right away. I hung up, my skin prickling with an unease I couldn't shake. The house suddenly felt different, like something unseen had shifted. I turned off the garage light and locked the door leading back inside. Then I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer. My hands were still shaking as I made my way downstairs, gripping the handle tightly. The others were still in the basement, looking up as I entered. I didn't need to say anything. They could see it on my face. Without another word, we moved to the storage room at the back of the basement, the coldest, darkest part of the house. We huddled there, pressed between shelves stacked with holiday decorations and old clothes, waiting. Every creak of the house sent a jolt through my body. The minutes dragged, stretching into what felt like hours. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. No one spoke. Then, finally, headlights swept across the front windows. The distant hum of an engine cut through the silence. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My parents were home. We bolted from the storage room as soon as we heard the front door open, all four of us spilling into the main basement area. I ran upstairs, nearly colliding with my dad as he stepped inside. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the house. My mom was right behind him, her gaze flicking to me, to the locked doors, to the dog still lying on the floor. I tried to explain again, but my words came out too fast, jumbled, a mess. My dad just nodded, pressing his lips together. He checked the doors himself, then the windows, then the garage, moving through the house with quiet precision. Everything was locked now. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Just the dog, somehow inside. Just the doors, somehow open. They stayed up for a while after that, checking, double-checking, making sure we were safe. We didn't go back to the basement. None of us wanted to be that far from the rest of the house. Eventually, my parents told us to get some sleep. I lay awake in my bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to every small noise the house made. To this day, I don't know what happened. Maybe I had somehow forgotten to lock the door. Maybe it hadn't latched all the way. Maybe. But I know I locked it. I remember the feeling of it, the weight of the door, the solid click as the deadbolt turned. And yet somehow, Nugget got inside. And somehow, the doors stood open. Halloween night felt like the perfect excuse to do something stupid. My sister and her friends had been talking about some old house they heard was haunted, going on and on about how creepy it looked, how people said they heard things inside, the usual kind of rumors that spread around small towns. They weren't the type to actually go out and check it themselves, though. They liked talking about spooky stuff, but when it came to actually doing anything, they always chickened out. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, and I didn't think the house would be anything special, but I figured it could at least be fun to scare them a little. I told them I'd drive them out there, make a night of it. They were all excited at first, but the closer we got to leaving, the more nervous they got. I almost expected one of them to back out, but in the end, They all climbed into my car, bundled up in hoodies, passing around a bag of candy they'd collected earlier. The house was supposed to be on a long, quiet road just outside of town. Not many people lived out that way. Mostly farmland and thick tree lines. The kind of place where the woods were dark even in the middle of the day. I had been down that road once or twice before, but never really paid attention to the houses. If I had passed this one before, I didn't remember it. We drove in the dark, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the black trees on either side of us. The road was rough, cracked with potholes, and I had to slow down to keep from bouncing us too hard. My sister and her friends were quiet now, not laughing or talking as much as they had been earlier. I think they were waiting to see it, to see if the house really looked as bad as people said. But when we got to where it was supposed to be, there was nothing. Just an empty field. I slowed to a stop, confused. The lot was big, overgrown with dead grass and scattered with weeds, but there was no house. No sign that there had ever been one. For a few seconds, none of us said anything. I could feel them all waiting for me to say something first, but I didn't know what to say. My headlights stretched out over the grass, the beams disappearing into the dark, but there was nothing there. No foundation, no rubble, nothing. Just a field like there had never been a house there at all. I checked the address on my phone. This was definitely the spot. Maybe we had gotten it wrong, though. Maybe it was further down the road. I kept driving. The road only went another mile or so before ending at an old bridge. But when we got there, the bridge was gone. It looked like it had been washed away recently. The road just ended at a steep drop-off into a shallow, muddy creek. There weren't even any barriers up yet, just some tire tracks leading too close to the edge, where someone must have realized too late that the bridge wasn't there anymore. I sat there for a second, looking at the gap where the bridge used to be. Then I put the car in reverse and turned around. I didn't say anything as we drove back the way we came. Neither did anyone else. It wasn't scary, exactly, just strange. A house that was supposed to be there wasn't, and a bridge that should have been there was gone. It was just weird. As we got closer to the spot where the house should have been, I noticed something in the corner of my eye. A faint, flickering reflection. I slowed down, my foot barely pressing the brake. The reflection was coming from my headlights bouncing off something. And then I saw it. The house. It was right there, standing in the empty lot. A big, two-story house, dark and silent, exactly where it was supposed to be. I don't know how we had missed it. We had stopped here. We had looked. It wasn't here. But now it was. I pulled off to the side of the road and just stared at it. The windows were black, empty, the front porch sagging slightly under its own weight. It looked abandoned, but not ruined. Like no one had lived there in a long time, but it hadn't quite started falling apart yet. I felt my sister shift in her seat beside me. I could hear the way her friends were breathing in the back seat, fast and shallow. We sat there for a long minute, just staring. Then, in the mirror, I saw headlights. A car was coming up behind us. I glanced at the road ahead, remembering the missing bridge. This road didn't lead anywhere now. Whoever was coming up behind us had to have come from the opposite direction. But that wasn't possible. I watched as the headlights moved down the road. They reached the spot where the bridge should have been, but instead of stopping, they kept going, right over the gap. I didn't wait to see anything else. I hit the gas. The car lurched forward, kicking up gravel as we sped away. I didn't care how fast I was going. I just wanted to be as far from that spot as possible. Nobody spoke. Not a word. I could feel how tense they all were, could hear the way they were breathing, but no one said anything. We drove all the way back to town in complete silence. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know why the house wasn't there at first, or why it appeared when we were coming back. I don't know how that car crossed a bridge that didn't exist. We laugh about it now, about how scared we were, about how stupid it was to get freaked out over nothing. But I'll never forget how quiet that car ride home was. The way nobody said a word. Like we all knew deep down that we had seen something we weren't supposed to. I was about 10 years old when it happened. It's been so long now, but I can still remember the way my stomach dropped, the way my throat locked up like I had swallowed something too big to get down. There were a lot of things about that house that scared me, things I could never explain properly. Some of them I brushed off, told myself I was imagining things, that my brain was just playing tricks on me because I was a kid and kids get scared. But that night, it wasn't something my brain made up. It wasn't some childhood fear I outgrew. I know that because I can still feel it, even now. The house I grew up in wasn't anything special from the outside. It was a normal house, normal yard, normal neighborhood. But something about it never felt right. It wasn't just my room, it was the whole place. There was always this sense that something was just slightly off, like a picture hanging a little too crooked, a sound coming from the wrong direction. It didn't matter if the sun was shining or if every light in the house was on. It was always there, this background noise of unease. My parents never talked about anything weird, and my siblings didn't seem to notice, but I did. I was scared of the dark. I wasn't the kind of kid who would crack their door open for a nightlight or leave the TV on for comfort. I just shut my eyes and refused to open them until morning, because I knew if I did, I wouldn't like what I saw. I didn't even look around my room once the lights were off. I'd squeeze my eyes shut tight, pull the blanket up high, and just lay as still as I could until I fell asleep. That was my way of dealing with it. If I didn't see anything, nothing could see me. But that night, I had my dog, Ringo. He was a huge dog, probably about the same size as me back then. He wasn't supposed to sleep in my bed, but he did anyway, and I never stopped him. Having him with me made it easier to fall asleep. He took up most of the bed, and sometimes he kicked in his sleep, but I didn't care. He was warm, solid, and made me feel safe. Nothing ever felt scary when he was there. That night, I was just starting to drift off when I heard my bedroom door open. It was quiet, slow, the way it always sounded when someone tried not to wake me. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I knew it was Ringo. He'd left my room earlier in the evening, probably to go sniff around the kitchen, and now he was coming back to sleep with me. I mumbled his name, just to let him know I was awake, and I felt him jump up onto the bed, his weight landing across my legs. I reached down to pet him, stretching my hand toward the foot of the bed where I could feel his weight pressing down on me. My fingers brushed over the blanket, but I didn't feel fur. I ran my hand around the area, expecting to touch his big, warm body, but I couldn't find him. It was like he wasn't there, except I could still feel him. The pressure was still on my legs, heavy and unmoving. I sat up, keeping my eyes shut tight, and reached out again. My hand swept over empty space. The weight hadn't changed. It was still there, pressing down, but my hands touched nothing. My breath caught in my throat. My stomach twisted up. Every hair on my body stood on end. I knew Ringo was supposed to be there. He had to be there. I had heard him come in. I had felt him jump up. I could feel him right now. I opened my eyes. Nothing was there. The weight disappeared the second my eyes opened, like it had never been there at all. But I knew it had been. I had felt it. My legs still tingled from the pressure. The room was dark, the hallway outside my door just as pitch black. Everything was exactly how it should have been, except for the fact that I had just felt something that wasn't there. My mouth went dry. I tried to swallow, but my throat was too tight. Then I screamed. I don't even remember making the decision to scream. It just happened. A deep, raw terror exploded out of me, louder than I ever thought I could be. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I screamed and screamed until my mom came running up the stairs. I don't remember what happened after that. I don't know if she believed me. I don't know what I told her. I just remember how sick I felt, how my skin crawled as I sat there in bed, clutching my blanket with both hands, legs still tingling like something had just been resting on them. The rest of the night is a blur. I don't remember if I slept. I don't remember if I left my room. I don't even remember if Ringo ever came back. But I do remember that fear, the awful, gut-deep knowledge that something had been there, even though I couldn't see it. And it wasn't the last time something like that happened. That house, there was something wrong with it. There were things that never made sense, things that still make my skin crawl when I think about them. I don't know if I imagined all of it, but I do know this. That night was real. I felt it. I still feel it. And I will never forget it. I never used to think about what lurked in the dark. I mean, not really. Sure, I got creeped out by horror movies like anyone else, but that was just make-believe, something you could shake off after a while. But this was different. It started with my wife. A few years ago, she began having night terrors. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have nightmares. It happens. But hers were different. Every night, without fail, she would wake up gasping, clawing at the sheets, her eyes wide with panic. And every time, she'd say the same thing. There had been something standing over her. Not just a shadow, not a trick of the mind. She described it as a figure, dark and shapeless, almost like a living spill of ink hovering above her. It wouldn't do anything, just stand there. And then, after a few seconds, it would dissolve away, like it was never there to begin with. At first, I dismissed it. She didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, and neither did I. She chalked it up to her brain misfiring in that weird space between sleep and wakefulness. Some kind of sleep paralysis thing. But the way she spoke about it, the way her voice shook when she described it, it started to get under my skin. It wasn't just a one-time thing. This happened night after night. Weeks turned into months, and every single night, she would jolt awake in terror. Sometimes she would scream. Sometimes she would just lie there, trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. And I would hold her, tell her it was okay, that it was just a dream. But I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't convinced. The exhaustion started to wear on her. She wasn't getting enough sleep, constantly running on empty, her hands shaking as she made coffee in the mornings. She stopped reading before bed, something she had always loved. She even started leaving the lamp on some nights, which she never used to do. It wasn't just messing with her sleep, it was changing her. And I hated it. I hated seeing her like that. I hated feeling helpless. So one night, I decided to do something about it. I told her to switch sides of the bed with me. She didn't question it, just nodded, too tired to argue. We got into bed, and as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. I wasn't scared. Not in that moment. I was pissed. I kept thinking over and over, "Bring it, you son of a bitch." It wasn't a conscious prayer or anything, just this relentless, furious thought drilling itself into my skull. Come on. If you're real, if you're really out there, then bring it. I dare you. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I woke up fast, like my body knew something was wrong before my mind did. I opened my eyes and something was standing over me. It wasn't a dream. I knew that instantly. It was right there looming, inches from my face. It was just like she had described, a shape vaguely human, but wrong. A mass of shifting black, like an ink spill trying to hold itself together. It had no face, no eyes, no features at all. But I could feel it looking at me. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, it felt like nothing. Not like emptiness. Not like darkness. Just nothing. Like something that wasn't supposed to exist. The air around it felt wrong, like it was sucking something out of the room, leaving everything muted, drained. It wasn't cold or hot. It wasn't heavy or light. It was just there, pressing into my chest, making my skin crawl. And something inside me snapped. I didn't move. Didn't scream. I lashed out. Not physically. Not with my hands. But with my mind, my whole being. I can't explain it properly, but in that moment, I felt something deep and raw rising up in me. Something that had been building for months. I thought about my wife, about how much she had suffered, about how exhausted and afraid she had been every single night. And I shoved all of that at it. It wasn't words. It wasn't even a fully formed thought. Just get out. The thing flickered. Not like it moved, more like it lost cohesion for a second. Like my anger had hit it, pushed it back. I didn't stop. I kept going, that feeling growing stronger, turning into something vicious, something territorial. This was my home, my wife, my life. I was done letting this thing terrorize us. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe a few seconds, maybe an eternity. And then, it was gone. Not like it disappeared, more like it just dissolved. Like smoke dispersing in the air, like ink sinking into water. The room was silent. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. I was calm. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. I rolled over and went back to sleep. And that was it. My wife never had another night terror after that. No more waking up screaming. No more shaking hands in the morning. No more leaving the lamp on at night. She doesn't talk about it much. If I bring it up, she just shrugs and says it must have been some weird phase her brain went through. Maybe hormones, maybe stress, maybe just a long string of bad dreams. I don't argue with her, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know deep down that whatever it was, it knew it wasn't welcome anymore. It's been 2 years, and I haven't seen it since. It was late summer when my friend invited me to his birthday sleepover. He lived out in Yakima, near an orchard field that stretched for miles in every direction. It wasn't just neat rows of trees. There were trails, a creek, and dense patches of woods that cut through the farmland. It felt wild compared to the suburban neighborhoods I was used to. My brother, who was 14 at the time, came along, and a few other friends were there too. We spent the evening doing the usual birthday stuff, eating cake, watching a movie, hanging out. The sun dipped low, and the air cooled in that way it does on summer nights, warm but with a bit of chill creeping in. The windows were open, letting in the smells of dry grass and ripe fruit from the orchard. We weren't ready to sleep yet, and my friend's dog had run off a couple of days before. I suggested we go look for him, not just because of the dog, though that was a good excuse, but because we liked running around in the dark. It was an adventure. We had flashlights and binoculars, a group of us, and the orchard felt like the perfect place to explore. We left the house and started down the dirt road that led into the fields. The orchard rows were neat at first, but as we walked, the trees got wilder, growing closer together. The dirt under our shoes was packed hard, with patches of dry weeds sticking up between the tracks. We turned off onto one of the beaten trails, a path that cut through the orchard towards the creek. The moon was out, casting everything in pale silver light, but the trees blocked most of it, making the ground darker. Our flashlights cut through the shadows, bouncing off the trunks and leaves. We weren't being quiet. We walked and talked, pointing out shapes in the dark, scanning the distance for any sign of the dog. The orchard was silent except for the occasional rustle in the leaves, probably a rabbit or something small moving around. The dirt path wound through the trees until we reached the creek. It was shallow, barely more than a stream, but the banks were steep and the water glistened in the moonlight. On the other side, the land sloped up into hills, covered in tall grass that moved in the wind. We stopped for a moment, shining our flashlights around, looking for any movement. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I do remember turning my head slightly and catching something in the corner of my eye. It was on top of the hill, a shape just standing there. I pulled out the binoculars, focusing on the figure. My stomach dropped. It was moving, not just moving, running. It came down the hill fast, straight towards us. I froze. The grass behind it flattened as it ran, swaying and parting where it moved. My brain struggled to make sense of it. It looked furry, but it was on two legs, huge, covering ground way too quickly. My first thought was that I was seeing things wrong. I blinked, adjusted the focus, tried to convince myself that it was just some trick of the light. But it kept coming, the tall grass bending in its wake. I shoved the binoculars at my brother. Look. He took them, raised them to his eyes. He didn't even hesitate. 5 seconds, maybe less. He dropped the binoculars. They hit the dirt, and he bolted. Full sprint. No words. Just gone. Something about the way he ran, the sheer, wordless panic, made my own fear snap into place. He wasn't the kind of person to mess around. If he ran, it meant something was wrong. Really wrong. I took off after him, the others right behind me. The orchard blurred past as we sprinted back toward the house. The ground was uneven, branches grabbed at my arms, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I could hear my own breath, the pounding of feet against dirt, the dry scrape of leaves and weeds as we tore through the path. We reached the dirt road, ran until we hit the driveway, and didn't stop until we were inside. My brother was already there, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. My heart was hammering. We didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, breathing hard, looking at each other. Then my friend's mom asked what happened. Neither of us had a good answer. I don't remember what we told them that night. Probably something about seeing an animal, trying to downplay it. But we didn't go back outside. Later, lying on the floor in our sleeping bags, I kept thinking about what I saw. The way it moved, the way the grass bent behind it, the way my brother ran. Years passed. Sometimes my mom brings it up, joking about how scared we were that night. But whenever my brother and I talk about it, we both agree on one thing. That wasn't a person. I was 20 years old when it happened, and even though almost 8 years have passed, I still think about it sometimes. Not in a casual way, either. It's one of those memories that still makes my stomach tighten and my skin crawl whenever it crosses my mind. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, sick feeling that settled into my bones while I lived there. Something unnatural, but not in the ghost story way. More like something was off, like we weren't supposed to be there, like we had walked into something we weren't meant to see, or feel, or even understand. It all started when my best friend and I were both in a rough spot and needed a place to live as soon as possible. We were desperate, and when you're desperate, you don't have the luxury of being picky. We found this basement apartment near downtown that was absolute garbage, but it was a 2-bedroom for only $650 a month. That was rare, even back then, so we jumped on it without thinking too much about the details. At the time, we just told ourselves it was temporary, that we'd stay until we found something better. The place was worse than we expected. The basement was damp, cold, and smelled like mildew no matter how many times we cleaned. The walls felt thin, like they weren't built properly, and the only real windows we had were these tiny, high-up ones that let in just enough light to remind us how much we were missing out on the world above. The floors were uneven, the ceiling was low, and the whole place just felt wrong. But the biggest problem was the landlord. The guy who owned the house lived upstairs, and he gave off the worst vibe I'd ever felt in my life. He was quiet, never spoke much, but whenever we saw him, it felt like he was watching us too closely. He had this little storage space that he could access directly from the other side of my bedroom wall, and from the second I moved in, I hated knowing that he had access to a space right there, right where I slept. It didn't help that the walls were so thin I could sometimes hear movement behind them, shifting noises, faint scraping, like something was being dragged or adjusted in there. At first, I figured it was just me being paranoid. New places take some getting used to, right? But then the nightmares started. I've had bad dreams before, but this was different. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering so fast it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. But no matter how hard I tried, I could never remember what the dreams were about. It was just this overwhelming sense of terror, like I had seen or felt something so awful that my brain refused to let me hold on to it. And it wasn't just once or twice. It was every night. By the end of the first week, I couldn't even stay in my room alone without feeling like someone, or something, was about to burst through the wall and grab me. It was so strong, so real, that I couldn't ignore it anymore. My best friend's room was barely big enough to be called a closet, so she didn't mind moving into my room with me. At least that way, we wouldn't be alone. It helped a little, but even with both of us in there, the feeling never fully went away. That was around the time we started noticing the upstairs window. The backyard was small, fenced in, nothing special. Whenever I took the dog out at night, I always had this weird sensation, like I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. The whole situation was already freaking me out, so of course I'd be on edge. But then I actually saw it. There was a window on the second floor, one that overlooked the backyard. And every single time I went outside at night, there was someone standing there. I could never make out the face, just the dark outline of a figure, always watching. I didn't say anything at first. Again, I kept trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But one night, my best friend came outside with me, and before I could even say a word, she grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you see that?" She had noticed it too. After that, I started getting careless. I'd stare too long, trying to make out details. I'd stay outside just a little later, trying to catch some kind of movement. It felt like a challenge, like I needed to know what was going on. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that was a mistake. The real breaking point came one night when we were out with our mutual friend. The three of us had met a while back, and he had become like our third roommate, even though he didn't officially live with us. He crashed on the couch more often than not, and honestly, we liked having him around. That night, after hanging out, he decided to head home while my roommate and I stayed up talking for a few more hours. Around 3 in the morning, we decided we should probably get some sleep, but first, I had to take the dog out. I stepped outside with the leash in hand, standing by the door as my dog sniffed around. My best friend was right behind me, waiting by the doorway. And then I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw them move. Dark shadows, people-shaped, walking toward us. Something in my brain snapped. I don't know what came over me, but I screamed at my friend to get inside. She didn't question it, just turned and ran, and I yanked my dog's leash so hard that she yelped as I dragged her in after me. We slammed the door and locked it, our breathing ragged, hearts pounding. Then, just as we were about to convince ourselves it was nothing, we saw them. Red eyes. 2 glowing red eyes peering through the tiny basement window near the bottom of the stairs. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because suddenly my friend's phone was ringing, and it was our mutual friend. the one who had gone home earlier. He had no reason to call, but he told us later that he just had a feeling. We begged him to come back, and he did. For the next 2 weeks, he slept at our place every single night. We never talked about what we saw. Not really. Not because we didn't want to, but because we couldn't. Every time we tried to describe it, the words didn't come out right. It sounded stupid when we said it out loud, like it was something made up, something that should have been easy to explain, but somehow wasn't. All we knew was that we had to get out. We found another place as fast as we could. It was smaller and more expensive, but it didn't matter. We packed up and left, and when we handed in our keys, we didn't even look back. I don't know what was wrong with that place. Maybe it was the landlord. Maybe it was someone else living in the house. Maybe it was something even worse that I don't want to think about. But I know one thing for sure. Even now, years later, whenever I pass that house on the streetcar, I still get that same sick feeling in my stomach. And no matter how many times I tell myself I'm just being paranoid, I never ever look at the upstairs window. We were exhausted. That kind of exhaustion where every movement feels heavy, like you're dragging yourself through thick mud. Carowinds had drained us completely. Heat, roller coasters, overpriced food, all of it. I could still feel the way my stomach had dropped on the last ride, the ghost of the G-force twisting my insides. It was 1 a.m. on a Monday night in the middle of summer, and we were supposed to be heading home. None of us had the energy for it. The one friend who actually had a license was practically asleep in the back seat, his head tilted against the window, mouth slightly open. He'd driven us there in the morning, but now he was done. He didn't even argue, just mumbled that he was too tired and passed out before I could even protest, which meant I had to drive. I didn't have a license, hadn't even really practiced beyond the basics, but I didn't see another option. I wasn't about to wake up parents in the middle of the night asking for help, and there were no hotels around that we could afford. So I took the keys, climbed into the driver's seat of a car that wasn't mine, and told myself I'd just follow every rule exactly. No reason to get pulled over if I was doing everything right. The road was empty, just dark stretches of pavement cutting through nothing. The kind of nothing that starts playing tricks on your eyes after a while. I kept the speed limit, didn't swerve, didn't do anything that would make me stand out. My hands were locked on the wheel in a death grip, my knuckles stiff and aching. Every now and then, I'd check the rearview mirror out of habit, but there was never anyone there. Then, after 20 minutes of seeing nothing but darkness behind us, headlights appeared. A van. It came fast, closing the distance between us like it had been waiting, like it had been watching. My stomach tightened. My first thought was cops. Undercover, unmarked, whatever. My brain had been conditioned to assume the worst. If I got pulled over, I was screwed. No license, driving someone else's car. I didn't even know what would happen, but it wouldn't be good. The van got closer, then closer. It was tailgating me now, close enough that I could see the reflection of my brake lights bouncing off its grille. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But it was right there, inches from the back of the car, its headlights glaring too bright in the mirror, making it hard to see. I tried to ignore it, just focused on driving, but it wouldn't stop. I woke up my friends. They sat up groggily, rubbing their faces, and then I felt it shift, the energy in the car. The way exhaustion turned into something sharper. Alert, uncomfortable. No one said anything, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Then, suddenly, the van swerved into the passing lane. For a moment, I thought it was going to try and run me off the road, but it didn't. It just sped past, a blur of dark metal and tinted windows. I exhaled hard, feeling my chest loosen for the first time in minutes. I watched its taillights shrink in the distance, and then brighten. The van had pulled off the road. My fingers clenched around the steering wheel. We passed it. I didn't look, but I could feel it sitting there on the side of the road. A heavy presence. Then, as soon as we passed, it pulled back onto the highway. This time, it didn't tailgate, just kept its distance. Not too far, but not close enough to seem aggressive. A steady shadow in the rearview mirror. None of us talked. The air in the car felt tight, heavy. Every nerve in my body was telling me not to stop. Just keep going. But another problem was creeping up on us, one we couldn't ignore. We had to pee. Badly. I tried to hold it. Focused on the lines on the road, the glow of the dashboard, anything but the growing pressure in my stomach. But it wasn't going away. Someone in the back shifted uncomfortably. We all had the same problem. Then we saw it, a rest stop sign. I hesitated. Stopping felt like a mistake, but I knew we didn't have a choice. I signaled, merged onto the exit, pulled into the lot. The van followed. I parked near the front, where a few other cars were scattered under the flickering fluorescent lights. The building was small, just a basic roadside stop, vending machines, restrooms, nothing else. The van pulled in a few rows away. No one got out. We sat there, waiting, watching. Every instinct told me not to step out of the car, but we couldn't just sit there forever. The parking lot wasn't empty. A few people were walking back and forth, stretching their legs. A couple leaned against their truck, drinking sodas from a vending machine. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. We decided to take turns. Half of us would go in, the other half would stay and watch. I went first. The second my feet hit the pavement, I felt exposed. The air was thick and humid, pressing against my skin. The bright lights made everything feel unnatural, casting hard shadows. I walked fast, didn't look back, just made it to the bathroom and did what I needed to do as quickly as possible. When I came back out, nothing had changed. The van was still sitting there. Its engine was off. The others went in. Still nothing. It felt like a waiting game. Like whoever was inside was just sitting there, watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. We stayed in the car for a while after that, pretending to scroll through our phones, pretending we weren't paying attention. But we were. Finally, headlights appeared at the entrance. Another car pulling in. The second they parked, I started the engine and pulled out. We followed that car back onto the highway. The van didn't move. I kept checking the mirror, waiting for it to follow. But it never did. We didn't talk much the rest of the way. Just let the exhaustion take over again, settling into our bones, dulling the edges of the night. But none of us really slept. And when we finally got home, when I finally handed the keys back to my friend and walked into my own house, I didn't feel relieved. Just unsettled. Because I knew somewhere out there, on some dark stretch of road, that van was still driving, still waiting, and I had no idea what would have happened if we had made a different choice. I don't know how old I was, but I was small, maybe 2, maybe 3. Too young to really understand the world, but old enough for some things to stick, even after all these years. It's strange the way memories work. Most of those early years are nothing but a fog, little flashes of color, voices, maybe a toy in my hand. But this one moment, it's burned in my brain like a scar. It's the only thing from that time that stayed. We were in the car, my dad, my uncle, and me. I don't remember where we were coming from, but I know where we were going. Anchorage. There's a stretch of highway that runs through swampy land, long and straight, like someone took a knife and carved it through the landscape. If you've been there, you know what I mean. Flat land on either side, water pooled in places where the earth dipped too low. You can see for miles in some parts, nothing but road and sky and the occasional cluster of trees. I was strapped to my dad's chest in one of those baby harness things, the kind that lets you carry your kid like a backpack, but on the front. I don't remember sitting in the car seat before that. I don't remember if I was asleep or awake when it happened, but I remember the impact. The motorcyclist came out of nowhere. 1 second, we were just driving. Nothing unusual, no traffic, no sharp turns, no distractions. Just the road stretching ahead and the hum of the engine. The next, there was a flash of movement, something coming too fast, wrong direction, shouldn't be there. The bike was small, not one of those big touring motorcycles, more like something built for speed, light and fast. It wasn't swerving, it wasn't trying to dodge or correct, it was just coming straight into our lane. I didn't know what was happening, but I remember the lurch. The car jolted, not like a normal stop, not even like slamming on the brakes. It was harder than that, sudden and violent, like something trying to rip the car backward. The sound was worse. A deep, crunching thud, metal twisting, breaking, the kind of sound that sticks with you even when it's gone. Then silence. I don't think I cried. Maybe I did at first. Maybe I didn't understand enough to be scared. My dad and uncle didn't sit there stunned, didn't freeze up like in movies. They moved fast. The doors flew open. My dad took me with him as he got out, not even thinking to unstrap me, just taking me along like an extension of himself. The air outside was heavy, damp. That kind of humid, thick feeling you get near the water, but mixed with something else, something metallic. Blood. The biker was on the ground, face down, twisted like a doll dropped from too high up. His bike was nowhere near him, thrown into the swampy patch off the highway, half sunk in the mud. My uncle was already heading toward him, and my dad followed. I was there too, strapped to his chest, my face near his shoulder as he crouched down. I don't remember what my uncle did. I wasn't watching him. I was watching the man. Blood spread out from beneath him, dark and thick, soaking into the pavement. I don't know how much, but enough to stick in my mind even now. The kind of amount that tells you, even as a kid, that something is really, really wrong. Then he moved. Not his whole body. Just a roll, slow and unnatural, like his limbs weren't working right, like he was trying to turn over, but couldn't get it right. His head tilted up first. And then I saw his face, or what was left of it. From the nose down, there was nothing but raw flesh, muscle and bone exposed like something had torn it away. The skin was gone, the mouth just an open mess of red and white, blood pooling at the edges. His teeth were visible, some broken, some missing. His jaw wasn't sitting right. I don't know if it was dislocated or shattered, but it didn't look real. It looked like something out of a butcher shop, meat that shouldn't still be attached to a person. And his eyes, they locked onto mine. I don't know if he really saw me. I don't know if there was anything left in him to recognize what he was looking at. But his eyes met mine, and something deep inside me locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't look away, couldn't breathe. Just staring into those eyes, wide and glassy, filled with something I didn't understand at the time. Pain. Not just the kind that makes you scream. The deep, horrible kind. The kind you don't come back from. Then the noise. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even a groan. It was something between a gasp and a wheeze. A sound that came from somewhere deep in his throat, wet and strangled. Like he was trying to say something, like he wanted to speak, but didn't have the pieces left to do it. I felt it more than heard it. The way the sound crawled inside my chest made my skin feel too tight. My stomach dropped like I was falling even though I wasn't moving. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. His chest didn't rise again. His eyes didn't move. He just stopped. I don't remember what happened next. Maybe my dad moved away. Maybe my uncle said something. Maybe sirens came, lights flashing, people running around. I don't remember any of that. It's like my mind cut the scene off right there, like it didn't want to keep the rest. But the man's face? His eyes? The sound he made? That stayed. It still does. Sometimes, late at night, I'll be lying in bed and I'll see him. Not in the way people say they see ghosts, not like an actual figure standing in my room. Just in my mind, sudden and sharp, as if I just looked away from him a second ago. Sometimes I dream about him, the moment repeating itself exactly as it happened, the same stretch of highway, the same crash, the same eyes locking onto mine before everything goes quiet. Other times, it's different. I'm older in those dreams, standing on that highway alone. The road is empty, the night is too quiet. Then I hear it, the same noise, the same wet, strangled sound, but coming from behind me. I don't want to turn around. I know what I'll see. But in dreams, you don't get to choose. I turn, and he's there, still lying on the pavement, still watching me, still making that awful, awful sound. I wake up before anything else happens. But the feeling stays. The cold sweat, the way my chest feels tight, the way my stomach turns like I just got punched. I don't know if the dreams mean anything. I don't believe in ghosts, not really. But that moment is stuck with me, deep in my bones, and no matter how much time passes, I don't think it's ever going to fade. It's strange how memory works. How some things vanish, how others linger like a stain that won't wash out. I don't remember my childhood, but I remember him. It was sometime in 2007, late summer if I remember right. The air was heavy and still, the kind of heat that wraps around you and makes the sweat stick to your skin. My son and I had gone for a walk in the woods behind our house. Nothing unusual about that. I'd taken him back there plenty of times before. It was quiet, just the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. He was only 5, full of that kind of energy kids have when everything is new and exciting. I let him walk ahead, watching as he stomped through the leaves and kicked at sticks. He was talking about something, but I wasn't really listening. I was half distracted, enjoying the quiet of the woods and the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. Then, he stopped and turned to look at me. He said he wanted to show me something. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids say things like that all the time. Probably just some bug he found or a weird-shaped tree. I told him to go ahead, and he took off down a narrow path I didn't recognize. That was odd. I knew these woods well, or at least I thought I did. I'd spent years walking through them, hunting, hiking, just getting away from things. But I'd never noticed this trail before. I hesitated for a second, but followed him. The path was narrow and winding, overgrown in places, like it hadn't been used in years. The trees pressed in closer, their branches arching overhead, blocking out some of the light. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just our footsteps crunching against the dry ground. After a few minutes, I started to feel uneasy. I knew this area well, and this trail didn't lead anywhere. At least, it shouldn't have. I had always thought it just dead-ended. But my son kept walking like he knew exactly where he was going. Then, we stepped into a small clearing, and I saw it. An old house. Not a big house, not even a proper cabin. More like a shack. It was barely standing, the roof sagging, the walls weathered and gray. Vines crept up the sides, and the door hung slightly askew, like it had been forced shut and never quite fit right again. I stopped in my tracks. There shouldn't have been a house here. This land wasn't developed, and I had never seen any signs of a building. No foundations, no remains of anything, no old roads leading up to it. It was just there, like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. I asked my son how he knew about it. He told me it was where he and his friend Tom came to play when Tom couldn't sleep. I just stared at him for a second. I knew about Tom. Tom wasn't real. Just an imaginary friend he'd talk about sometimes. Every kid has one, nothing weird about that. But the way he said it, like it was completely normal, made my stomach feel tight. I asked him again how he knew the house was here. He just shrugged and said Tom brought him. That didn't make sense. He had never been back in these woods alone. I would have known if he had. And yet, he walked straight here like he'd done it 100 times before. I stepped toward the house. The closer I got, the worse it looked. The walls weren't just worn down, they were warped. The wood was cracked and rotting in places. The windows were smeared with dirt and so clouded over I couldn't see inside. It smelled damp, like old wood and earth. I reached for the door, but my son stopped me. He told me not to bother, that Tom blocked the door with things so no one could steal his stuff. I pulled the handle anyway. The door moved an inch before it hit something solid. I pushed harder, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel resistance, like there was something heavy behind it. Through the small gap, I could see a sliver of darkness inside, but nothing else. Something about it made my skin crawl. I let go of the door and stepped back. The house was dead quiet. No movement, no signs of life. I turned to my son, but he was already heading back toward the trail like the whole thing wasn't strange at all. I followed, but I kept looking back over my shoulder. The longer I looked at the house, the more it felt wrong. Not haunted or anything, just forgotten. Like something that should have been erased but wasn't. By the time we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked him about it a few more times over the next few weeks, but he never gave me a straight answer. Sometimes he acted like it was just another place he played, and other times he barely remembered it. Then one day, he told me Tom got sick and had to leave. That was the last time he ever mentioned Tom. I wanted to go back. I wanted to see the house again, maybe find a way inside, figure out why it was there. But life got busy, and I never got around to it. A few years later, they came through and cleared out the woods for a Kroger. Everything back there was torn down, leveled. The house, the trees, the trails, all of it. I drove past the site once after they finished building. Stood in the parking lot, trying to figure out where the trail would have been. But there was nothing left. Just pavement and bright lights. I still think about that house sometimes. I think about how it was hidden away in the middle of nowhere. How my son knew exactly where it was even though he shouldn't have. And I think about what was behind that door. What was inside that house, sitting there in the dark, just beyond my reach. I used to live near a graveyard. Not right next to it, but close enough that I could walk there in about 10 minutes. It wasn't a big cemetery, just a small plot of land with maybe 60 or 70 headstones, most of them old, weathered, and forgotten. Some had names and dates so worn down that you had to crouch close and trace the letters with your fingers to make them out. Others had fresh flowers, showing that someone still came to visit. It was the kind of place most people avoided after dark, but I wasn't like most people. I liked the quiet. The graveyard was peaceful, isolated. When I needed to be alone, it was the best place to go. Even at night, it never felt threatening. Just still, calm. I had been there dozens of times, usually sitting in the same spot, just thinking. The only noises were the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hum of a car passing on a nearby road. At some point, I got interested in the paranormal. Not in a hardcore way, no equipment, no ghost hunting gear, nothing like that. Just curiosity. I liked the idea that there could be something beyond what we could see, and I figured if there was ever a place to experience it, it would be there. I mentioned my plan to some friends, telling them I was going to try reaching out to any spirits that might be around. They all told me it was a bad idea. They weren't joking about it either. Usually if you bring up ghosts, people laugh or make fun of you, but they were serious. They told me not to do it, that it was disrespectful, that I didn't know what I was messing with. I waved them off. I wasn't planning anything crazy, just asking a few questions, seeing if anything happened. In hindsight, I should have listened. That night, I left my house at around 2:45 a.m. The walk to the graveyard was uneventful, just the crunch of my footsteps on the pavement, the occasional gust of wind. It was cold, but not uncomfortably so, just enough that my breath fogged in the air. The entrance to the graveyard had a rusty gate, but it was never locked. I slipped inside, the hinges groaning softly as I pulled it shut behind me. I spent the first few minutes walking around like I normally did, weaving between headstones, reading the names, stopping by my usual spot under a large tree. It was an old oak, its gnarled roots breaking through the soil in some places, its branches spreading wide like skeletal fingers. I sat there for a bit, just listening, waiting for the hour to change. At exactly 3 a.m., I got up and walked to the middle of the graveyard. The air felt different. Not heavy, not electric, just off. I tried to ignore it. I started asking questions. Simple things at first. Is anyone here that would like to speak? Nothing. Why are you still here? Silence. If someone is here, can you give me a sign? A breeze picked up, shifting the leaves, but that was it. I kept going, repeating myself, trying different questions. After about 10 minutes, I started getting frustrated. It felt ridiculous, standing there talking to nothing. I had expected at least something, maybe a feeling, a shift in the air, a weird noise. But there was nothing, just silence. So I made a mistake. I decided to try and provoke something. I started mocking the idea of spirits, calling them cowards, weak, pathetic. I don't even remember everything I said, but I know I wasn't exactly respectful. It was stupid, and I knew it was stupid even as I was doing it, but I kept going, letting my frustration take over. I wanted something to happen, even if it was just a gust of wind at the right time. Then I heard it. Laughter. It wasn't distant. It wasn't faint. It was close, maybe 10 feet away, just slightly to my left. It wasn't normal laughter either. It wasn't amused or light-hearted or even mocking. It was deliberate, slow, measured, like someone was savoring it, like they were savoring me. My entire body locked up. Every hair on my arms stood on end. The sound of it was wrong, something deep in my gut telling me I needed to leave right then. No hesitation. I ran. I didn't even look in the direction of the sound. I just turned and sprinted, my breath coming out in short, ragged gasps. The ground was uneven, my feet slipping on patches of grass, my hands brushing against cold stone as I barreled past headstones. The gate was up ahead, just a few more steps. I burst through it, not even stopping to close it behind me, and kept running. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't slow down until I saw my house. That's when I made another mistake. I thought I was safe. I let myself slow down, my breaths coming in heavy gulps. The adrenaline was still there, but the immediate panic had started to fade. My house was right there. Nothing had followed me. Then I heard it again, right over my shoulder. That same laughter. It was closer this time, right behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. I ran the last stretch to my door, fumbling with my keys, nearly dropping them before shoving the right one into the lock. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Silence. I stood there, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. No footsteps. No laughter. No breathing. Just silence. I went to my room, still feeling like something was watching me, but eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep. The next day, my friends saw me and didn't even need to ask what had happened. One of them just looked at me and said, "You pissed something off, didn't you?" Apparently, it was obvious. I didn't go back to the graveyard after that. A few nights later, I was out walking my dog, trying to shake the lingering paranoia. It had been a few days, and I had almost convinced myself that it was all in my head. Just an overactive imagination. Sleep deprivation. Something explainable. Then I heard it. A giggle. Not full laughter, just a short, breathy chuckle. It came from an empty hill about 50 feet away. No trees. No buildings. Just an open hill. My dog's ears perked up. He stared in that direction, completely still, his body tense. He heard it too. We went home. After that, it would happen every so often. Sometimes in the distance. Sometimes close. Always at night. I moved to a different state a year later. New town, new house, new everything. It was supposed to be a fresh start. The first night in my new home, I was lying in bed, finally feeling at peace. Then I heard it. Soft. Distant. But unmistakable. That same laughter. And I knew. It had followed me. We moved into the house when I was in 5th grade. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a simple 2-story home with unfinished rooms upstairs, the bare wood and insulation still exposed. My parents loved it. They saw potential in it, a place they could fix up, make their own. I didn't share their enthusiasm. There was something about the house that unsettled me from the very beginning. The man who sold it to us had made the process difficult. He hadn't wanted to move, and it showed. His wife had inherited another house, which was why they were leaving, but he resisted every step of the way. He fought my parents on small things, refusing to clean out the upstairs like they'd asked. My brother, who had arrived before we officially moved in, found the man tearing down the few pieces of sheetrock that had been put up and burning them in the backyard, along with bits of insulation and wood. As if that wasn't bad enough, after we moved in, we discovered he had shoved human feces into the air vents. I don't know what kind of person does something like that, but I remember my parents being furious. It took them hours to clean it all out, and the house smelled disgusting for days. That was my introduction to the house. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling I had about it. I told myself it was just a new place, that I'd get used to it. But the house was noisy, louder than it should have been. My mom noticed it too. She would hear the sound of something shattering, a plate, a glass, something falling and breaking. She'd rush into the room expecting to find a mess, but everything would be in its place, untouched. I was there one of the times it happened. I had been reading in my bedroom when I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. My mom ran in, expecting to find broken dishes on the floor, but nothing was out of place. She frowned, looking around like she thought she might have imagined it. But I had heard it too. There was no way both of us imagined the exact same sound at the same time. At night, the noises were worse. I was always a light sleeper, and in that house, I woke up most nights between 2 and 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something moving around. I would lie there, my breath held, listening. Sometimes I convinced myself it was just my dad getting up for a drink of water, but the footsteps didn't sound like his. They were slower, heavier, moving deliberately through the house. I imagined a burglar walking through our living room, creeping toward our bedrooms. My room was in the worst possible spot for this. It was positioned at the corner wall, between the front entrance and the living room. I could hear everything. Every shuffle, every creak, every strange sound in the house passed through my room first. I started to dread nightfall. As soon as my parents went to bed, I would lay there waiting, my ears straining for the first noise. When my parents finished the upstairs, things changed. I moved into my brother's old room. My brother moved into our parents' old room, and my parents moved into the newly finished space upstairs. I thought maybe being in a different room would make things better. Instead, it got worse. Now I was directly beneath the living room, the same space that had once been stripped of sheetrock, left exposed. The footsteps continued, but now they were right above me. Every night, I would wake up to the sound of someone walking around. I tried to rationalize it. We had a dog, a big one, and I told myself it was just him moving around. That explanation lasted until the night I decided to put it to the test. I let the dog sleep in my room with me, curled up on the floor beside my bed. I woke up around 2 in the morning, the familiar sound of footsteps overhead making my stomach drop. I held my breath, listening. The steps were slow, steady, deliberate. My dog, still beside me, didn't react. He didn't lift his head or bark. He didn't seem to hear it at all. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. For a little while after that, things settled down. I still felt uneasy in the house, but the footsteps didn't wake me up as often, and the crashing sounds my mom heard seemed to stop. I thought maybe I had imagined it all, that my mind had played tricks on me. But then, one night, everything changed. It was the night before a trip I had been looking forward to for months. I had packed my bag earlier in the evening, setting it by the door so I wouldn't forget anything in the morning. I went to bed excited but restless, unable to fall asleep right away. Sometime around 4 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, a faint hissing sound, just above the soft bubbling of my aquarium filter. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, still half asleep. I figured the filter was running low on water. It happened sometimes, and when it did, the motor would make weird noises. I made a mental note to add more water in the morning and laid back down. The sound got louder. It wasn't the filter. I sat up again, listening. The hissing sound had changed. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded like whispers. I tried to make out the words, but they were too quiet, just on the edge of understanding. But I could hear enough to know it was a conversation. Two voices, murmuring back and forth. I caught small fragments, words like she and it. My stomach twisted. It was coming from the living room. I stayed in bed for a long time, my heart hammering. Every rational part of me told me to stay put. If there were burglars in the house, I was safer where I was. But something about the whispering made my skin crawl. It wasn't normal. I forced myself to move, pushing back the blankets as quietly as possible. My feet hit the floor. I hesitated, then crept to the door and cracked it open. The whispering got louder. I stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, only the faint glow of the porch light filtering in through the curtains. My legs felt shaky as I moved forward, every step careful, deliberate. The whispering continued. I could make out the voices more clearly now, but I still couldn't understand the words. The living room opened up in front of me, empty except for the dog, lying on his bed. His head lifted when he saw me, but he didn't react to the whispering. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. If the dog wasn't hearing it, then what was I listening to? I kept walking, stopping at the archway that led to the stairs. The whispering was coming from there, just around the corner. I forced myself to move, my hands clenched into fists. I stepped around the corner. The stairway was empty, pitch black, silent. The whispering stopped. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness. My body felt frozen, every muscle locked in place. The house was so quiet now, almost like it had been waiting for me to get to this spot. I didn't go back to my room. I couldn't. Instead, I sat at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness, my heart pounding. The dog walked over and sat beside me, resting his head on my lap. I gripped onto his fur like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I stayed like that until morning, too afraid to move, too proud to wake my parents. That was just the beginning. Over the years, strange things continued to happen in that house. My mom saw a shadow pass through the hallway and down the stairs in the middle of the night. A horse in the neighbor's field died a violent death, and the owner completely lost his mind afterward. The house next door had a history of breaking up marriages. Every couple who moved in split up within months. An old farmhouse on the other side of my bedroom stood abandoned, no one ever lasting more than a few months before moving out. One night, while waiting for the bus in the dark, I heard a voice growl at me to go. Once, after sneaking through the backyard of the abandoned house, I found bruises on my arms and legs, finger-shaped, like someone had grabbed me. I don't live in that house anymore, but my parents still do. And sometimes, I wonder if the whispering ever really stopped. At the start of the year, I was put on a new medication for my bipolar disorder, lamotrigine. It was supposed to help, supposed to even things out, but I wasn't sure if it was working. There were little things that felt off. It's hard to explain, but it wasn't quite right. My sleep felt different. My thoughts felt different. I had headaches sometimes, and my body felt either too heavy or too light, like my balance was slightly off. I was waiting to see if it would settle, but after a few weeks, I knew I needed to talk to my doctor. Before I could make the appointment, my sister, who I lived with, went to Sydney for university. It wasn't unusual. She stayed there often, and I was used to being alone. Our duplex was on a quiet street, mostly families, but the other side of the duplex was rented out to a group of younger people, uni students mostly. They were fine, mostly kept to themselves, but they had parties sometimes. I didn't mind. The noise was oddly comforting, like knowing there were people nearby, even if I wasn't part of it. That Friday night, I went to bed around midnight. The party was still going strong, but I was used to sleeping through noise. I took my meds and crawled into bed, falling asleep as easily as I always did. I woke up sometime later, not sure at first why. The party was still going next door, but quieter now, like they'd moved inside. The air in my room felt different, colder maybe. I shifted under my blanket, eyes adjusting to the darkness. That's when I saw the curtains moving. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the window was closed. Then I saw him, a man in black, standing right next to my bed. My body reacted before my brain caught up. I screamed loud, raw, instinctual, and threw my pillow at him. The moment it left my hand, I realized something was wrong. The way he was standing, the way the room felt, it wasn't real. My brain clicked over, recognizing the hallucination for what it was. And then I started laughing. I don't know why. It wasn't funny, but something about the sheer absurdity of it, going from pure terror to immediate realization, made me laugh. I felt like an idiot. The fear drained out of me so fast it left me lightheaded. I giggled until my body gave out, then passed out again, just like that. The next morning, I sat in bed, replaying it over in my head. It was weird, really weird. I had never hallucinated before, not like that. Sure, sometimes I'd get sleep paralysis, or feel that strange in-between state when waking up too fast. But this was different. It was so real. The way he stood there, the way the fabric of his clothes looked in the dim light, the slight movement of my curtain, it had been perfect. Too perfect. I told my parents, and they told me to make a doctor's appointment on Monday. That was the logical thing to do. It made sense. But then came Saturday night. The storm started in the evening. A rare, rolling thunderstorm, deep and heavy, the kind that shakes the walls and rattles the windows. I loved storms. They were rare where I lived, so whenever one rolled in, I liked to sit by the window and watch. The lightning flashed in the distance, cutting jagged lines across the sky. My cat, restless from the noise, tore through the house like something was chasing her. I sat by the window for a while watching. The street was empty, wet pavement gleaming under the streetlights. I stared at the light across the road, thinking how eerie it would be if someone just appeared under it. Then, in the next flash of lightning, someone was there. I yanked the curtains shut so fast I nearly pulled them off the rail. My heart was hammering. I forced myself to take a deep breath. It wasn't real. I knew it wasn't real. It was just like the man beside my bed. Still, my hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone and called my mom. She asked if I wanted to come stay at their place. I told her no. It was fine. I was fine. I just needed to go to sleep. I tried. Sunday night, I stayed up late playing video games. 5 in the morning rolled around before I finally decided to sleep. I felt normal mostly. A little tired, but normal. I got up to get water from the kitchen, and as I walked past the laundry, I saw my cat slip inside. I reached out to pet her, flicking on the light. She wasn't there. I stood in the doorway, looking around. Nothing. The laundry was empty. Slowly, I turned back towards the hallway. My skin prickled, my arms breaking into goosebumps. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. I walked to the spare room, heart pounding, and peeked inside. My cat was curled up on the spare bed, deep asleep. I felt sick. I stopped taking the meds after that. By the time Monday came, I already knew what I was going to say to my doctor. The hallucinations stopped as soon as I stopped taking them. I didn't see another shadowy figure, didn't see anything under the streetlight, didn't see my cat in places she wasn't. It wasn't real. I knew that, but that didn't make it any less terrifying, because for those few days, I wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. I had never questioned my own senses before. Never felt that raw, splitting fear of seeing something that wasn't there, and knowing that my brain had made it up. It's a special kind of fear, realizing that your mind, something you're supposed to trust, something that's supposed to be yours, can turn on you like that. And the worst part, I wasn't scared of the man beside my bed. I wasn't scared of the figure under the streetlight. I wasn't scared of the cat in the laundry. I was scared of myself. I grew up in an old house, the kind with creaky wooden floors and walls that always seemed to settle when everything else was silent. It wasn't a place that looked haunted, at least not in the way people picture in movies. No rotting wallpaper, no broken furniture, no dust-covered chandeliers swaying for no reason. It was just a normal house. At least that's what I used to think. But weird things happened there, things that didn't make sense. You'd hear cabinets shutting in the middle of the night, even when you knew nobody was awake. Sometimes you'd be walking through a room and you'd get a chill up your back, like something was right behind you, close enough to touch. It always felt small, little things, little moments of unease. I never really talked about it. It was just part of the house. I didn't start to wonder if there was more to it until I was talking with my grandma the other day. The conversation was casual, just one of those moments where you bring up old memories for no real reason. I mentioned how strange it would be to go back, maybe knock on the door and ask the current owners if they'd ever experienced anything weird. I expected her to laugh or brush it off, but instead, she gave me this look. It was hard to describe, like she was debating whether or not to say something. And then she said it. The people we bought the house from had done the exact same thing. That stuck with me. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just a coincidence, but it made everything feel different, more real. I had spent my whole life wondering if the strange things I noticed were just in my head, but this wasn't just me. It had been happening long before we ever lived there. That made me think about something I hadn't thought about in years, Christmas Eve, when I was a kid. I was maybe 6 or 7. We were staying at my grandma's house for the holiday, which we always did back then. It was an old house, a single story, nothing fancy. My room was at the end of the hallway, the furthest from the living room. I had gone to bed excited, knowing that when I woke up, there would be presents under the tree, stockings filled, the smell of breakfast drifting through the house. But something woke me up in the middle of the night. Footsteps. At first, I was half asleep, not fully aware of what I was hearing. But as I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling, I realized the sound was coming from the living room. Slow, steady steps, moving across the floor. I was a kid, and it was Christmas Eve. My first thought wasn't fear. It was Santa Claus. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. I strained to listen, barely breathing. The footsteps were still there, moving softly but clearly. I knew I had to be quiet if I wanted to see him. I slipped out from under the covers, my socks silent against the cold wooden floor. The hallway was dark, but a faint glow came from the living room where the Christmas tree stood. I crept forward, careful not to make a sound. Before I even got to the end of the hall, I hesitated. Something felt off. I wasn't sure why, but my stomach tightened, and for the first time, a little doubt crept into my mind. I wasn't scared yet, just uncertain. But I kept going. I peeked around the corner. The living room was empty. The Christmas tree lights flickered softly, casting a warm glow, but there was nobody there. The footsteps had stopped. I held my breath, listening, and then I heard them again, from the kitchen. I turned my head, just barely able to see into the next room. I expected to see someone standing there. I was sure I would, but the kitchen was empty too. Then I heard it again, running, the sound of feet slapping against the floor. I didn't even think. I ran toward the kitchen, convinced I would catch a glimpse of whoever it was. But the second I got there, the sound was behind me, back in the living room. I spun around. Nothing. The footsteps started again, faster now. They moved through the house, always just ahead of me. Every time I got close, they would shift, just out of sight. It was like I was chasing something I could never quite catch. I ran harder, my socks sliding against the floor, breath coming fast. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was too caught up in the chase. But it didn't matter how fast I moved. The sound always stayed ahead of me, always slipping just beyond where I could see. Finally, I stopped. I stood there, panting, my chest rising and falling hard. My whole body was warm, my heart pounding. And I realized something. The footsteps had stopped too. The house was silent. That was the first moment I felt something other than excitement. I suddenly felt like I had done something wrong. Like I had been playing a game I didn't understand. My skin prickled. I looked around, the Christmas lights flickering across the walls. I should go back to bed. That thought came into my head suddenly, urgently. I should go back to bed and not think about this anymore. I turned and walked away, forcing myself to move slowly, even though I wanted to run. When I got back to my room, I shut the door behind me and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. My breath was still coming fast, my body still too warm. I stared up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I didn't have an answer. I never told anyone. It wasn't until years later, after I had moved out of that house, after I had grown up and left those childhood memories behind, that I thought about it again. And now, after that conversation with my grandma, after learning that the people before us had felt the same things, I can't stop thinking about it. It doesn't scare me, not in the way ghost stories do. It unsettles me, because whatever I had been chasing that night, whatever had been leading me through the house, it wasn't something I could see, and it wasn't something that was ever trying to be caught. When my cousin Jay and his wife faced financial difficulties, they moved into a property owned by her uncles in an old suburb of Toronto. The house was dilapidated but had an extra bedroom and functional heating, making it a temporary refuge for them and their 2 cats. For the first 4 months, life was uneventful. The situation began to change when the uncles rescued 2 additional cats, increasing the feline count to 4. Initially, there were subtle disturbances, occasional nocturnal noises and misplaced items like jewelry, which would later reappear. Jay, known for his absent-mindedness, often dismissed these incidents as his own oversight. However, the cats' behavior soon became unsettling. They would form a semicircle and hiss at the basement door, sometimes yowling so loudly at night that it disrupted everyone's sleep. Each time Jay and A investigated, the cats would scatter, and nothing unusual was found. This pattern persisted, leading the uncles to suspect a rodent infestation. An exterminator was called, who set traps and laid poison. After completing his work, the exterminator advised keeping the cats out of the basement. It was then that they realized none of them had ever seen the cats venture into the basement, even when the door was left open. The cats seemed to avoid it entirely. Approximately 6 months into their stay, a disturbing incident occurred. I was downstairs washing dishes while Jay was upstairs assisting the uncles with shelving. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs, culminating in the basement door slamming shut with such force that she dropped and shattered a dish. Irate, she yelled at Jay for his recklessness. Moments later, Jay appeared at the top of the stairs, alarmed by the noise and asking if she was all right. Realizing Jay had been upstairs the entire time sent a chill through A. They, along with the uncles, searched the basement but found nothing amiss. This incident prompted Jay and A to move out within a fortnight. The uncles didn't stay much longer and eventually sold the property to a developer. The site was later transformed into a commercial space housing a Tim Hortons, Wendy's, and Subway. Years later, A recounted the experience to a co-worker familiar with the suburb. The co-worker revealed that the house was notorious locally. An elderly woman had lived there alone with numerous cats. After her death, her body remained undiscovered for an extended period, during which the cats, left without food, resorted to feeding on her remains. This grim history had made the house a subject of local dares among children, particularly to peek into the basement windows. This revelation cast their unsettling experiences in a new, eerie light, intertwining their personal ordeal with the house's macabre past. I was 17 when I visited my friend in Korea for the summer. It was my first time traveling on my own, and I was excited to spend those few months in a different country, away from my parents, away from school, away from everything that felt routine and dull. My friend Mina had moved to Seoul with her family a few years prior, and ever since, we'd kept in touch through messages and video calls. When she invited me to visit, I jumped at the chance. The weeks I spent there were some of the best of my life. The city was alive in a way that was hard to describe. Crowded, loud, neon lights flashing, the smell of street food drifting from stalls lining the sidewalks. We spent our days exploring, eating, shopping, and our nights out late, wandering through neighborhoods packed with people. It felt safe, even at night, something I wasn't used to back home. That sense of security made us careless. That night, it was a Friday, and we had no reason to go home early. We had spent most of the evening at a karaoke bar, then stopped at a small street vendor for some tteokbokki before deciding to walk through a small park near Mina's apartment. It was quiet, nearly empty, with only a few streetlights casting long shadows along the path. We found a bench near the entrance and sat there, just talking and scrolling through our phones. That's when we noticed him. He couldn't have been older than 14 or 15. He walked past us, holding a box of fried chicken, moving at an unhurried pace. He looked ordinary, black hoodie, dark jeans, a slightly too long fringe that covered part of his face. He sat down a few benches away and started eating. We didn't think much of him. He was just some kid, probably waiting for someone or just enjoying his food before heading home. We didn't pay him any attention until we got up to leave. As we stood and started walking, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The boy had dropped a piece of fried chicken onto the ground, but he didn't bend down to pick it up. Instead, he let it sit there and then turned in our direction, starting to walk the same way. At first, we thought nothing of it. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was just lazy and didn't want to throw away his food. It wasn't that strange. We crossed the road, still chatting, when I glanced to my right and saw him again, on the other side of the street, walking parallel to us. I might have ignored it if it hadn't been for what happened next. He smiled and waved. There was something wrong with that smile. It was too wide, too forced, like he was trying to mimic an expression rather than genuinely feeling it. His hand moved in a slow, deliberate wave, as if he knew us. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. I turned to Mina. "Do you know him?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She frowned. "No." We both looked back at the boy. He was still watching us, still smiling. There was no reason to be scared of a kid. He was younger than us, smaller than us, but something about him put me on edge. There was something calculated about the way he was moving, about the way he had thrown us that expression. We had no reason to be afraid, but we were. We gave him a quick, awkward wave back and turned around, walking faster. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time, he was still there following. Mina was getting anxious. "Let's go inside somewhere," she said. A few blocks later, we spotted a small coffee house and ducked inside. It was nearly empty, with only a few customers scattered throughout. The warm light and the smell of coffee should have been comforting, but I felt no relief. I took a seat by the window while Mina ordered us drinks. Then I saw him. He had stopped a few feet from the cafe, standing at the corner of the street, half hidden by the shadows of the buildings. His head was slightly tilted, as if he was listening to something we couldn't hear. Then, slowly, he turned the corner and walked toward us. I felt my stomach drop. Mina came back with our drinks and sat across from me. She didn't have to ask. I could tell by her face that she had seen him too. "I'm going to the bathroom," she said suddenly. "Come with me." I didn't argue. Most public bathrooms in Korea are in separate buildings or hallways connected to cafes and restaurants. To get to this one, we had to leave through a side door and walk into a dimly lit hallway shared with other businesses. The bathroom itself was small, with only a few stalls. We went into the last one together. Mina was breathing fast. "He's following us," she whispered. "He's just a kid," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. Then the lights went out. The entire bathroom was plunged into darkness. Before I could react, the door was kicked open. I heard Mina gasp as we were shoved backward into the stall. Someone grabbed my hair, yanking my head back. A hand clamped over my mouth. Another hand pressed against my throat, something cold and sharp resting just below my jaw. I could hear Mina struggling beside me. She let out a choked sound of pain, her body jerking as if someone had struck her. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. I thought we were going to die. Then, suddenly, the pressure against my throat eased. The grip on my hair loosened. There was silence. Then a whisper, right against my ear. "Wrong one." And then, just like that, he was gone. I heard the bathroom door swing open, then slam shut. Mina and I stayed there in the dark, too shocked to move. My body was shaking so badly I could barely stand. It wasn't until we heard voices outside, workers checking the circuit breaker, asking if anyone was inside, that we finally stumbled out. The lights flickered back on. The bathroom door was slightly open, swinging on its hinges. We told the staff what had happened, but by the time they checked the hallway, there was no sign of him. No security cameras, no witnesses. It was as if he had never been there at all. We didn't go to the police. What would we have said? That a teenager followed us and attacked us in the bathroom? That he let us go because we weren't who he was looking for? The words felt hollow. That night, we barely spoke. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again. Wrong one. Who had he been looking for? And what would have happened if we had been the right ones? That summer, my twin brother and I spent most nights staying up late. It was the usual routine, playing games, watching TV, or just talking about random things until we got tired. Mom and Dad didn't really mind as long as we didn't make too much noise. The house was quiet most of the time, except for the occasional sound of crickets outside or the hum of the ceiling fan above us. It was just another night, nothing special, nothing unusual. At least, that's what we thought. Dad had a habit. Whenever he forgot his keys, which happened more often than it should have, he would knock on the door in a distinct rhythm. 3 quick knocks, a short pause, and then 2 more. It was his way of letting us know it was him. We had heard it so many times that we could recognize it instantly. That night, around 11 p.m., we were still downstairs, sitting on the couch, barely paying attention to whatever was on TV. It was one of those nights where time just passed without us noticing. Then, out of nowhere, we heard the knock. 3 short knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Without thinking, we both jumped up, heading straight for the door. We had done this plenty of times before. Dad must have forgotten his keys again. But just as we reached for the handle, something made us stop. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just a weird feeling. Instead of opening the door, we hesitated. Who is it? Silence. No answer. No movement. Nothing. We glanced at each other, confused. Maybe we had imagined it. It was late. We were tired. Maybe our brains were playing tricks on us. After a few seconds, we shrugged it off and turned away, walking back toward the couch. Then the knock came again. 3 short knocks. A pause. 2 more. Exactly the same. We froze. Our eyes met, and we knew we were both thinking the same thing. If Dad was outside, why wasn't he answering? He always responded right away when we asked. Always. A strange feeling crawled over my skin. I tried to push it away, to tell myself it was nothing, but I couldn't. Something about it didn't feel right. My brother took a step back. I did too. Then we heard it. The doorknob. A faint sound, metal shifting, like someone trying to turn it. But the door was locked. We weren't imagining that. We bolted, running up the stairs 2 at a time, our bare feet hitting the wooden steps hard. The house was suddenly too quiet. The air felt heavier. We reached the top, pausing just for a second to catch our breath. Maybe Dad was messing with us. Maybe he was trying to scare us for fun. Then we heard it again. The doorknob turning. Only this time, it was upstairs. It came from one of the rooms behind us. A slow, deliberate turn, as if someone was testing it. We didn't turn around. We didn't check. We just ran. We sprinted toward our room, shoving the door open, diving inside. We pushed the door shut with all our strength, trying to slam it closed. But it didn't close. It hit something. Something solid. The force sent the door flying back toward us. It didn't just stop. It rebounded, as if we had hit a person. As if someone had been running straight toward us at the exact moment we tried to shut the door. We fell backward onto the floor, scrambling up, panic taking over. Nothing. No one was there. We didn't wait to check. We threw ourselves onto the bed, diving under the covers, pulling them over our heads. We were breathing too fast, our hearts pounding so hard I thought they might burst. Then we heard the footsteps. Heavy, slow, moving through the hallway, past our door. I shut my eyes tight, pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. The footsteps stopped. Then silence. Seconds passed. Then minutes. We didn't move. Then, a voice. Mom. Dad. They were coming upstairs, asking what was going on. We didn't answer right away. It took us a few seconds to even process what was happening. When we finally found the courage to move, we threw the covers back and stumbled out of bed. The hallway was empty. Nothing was there. We ran to them, talking over each other, trying to explain what happened. Dad frowned. He hadn't left the house. Not once. We checked the front door. It was still locked. The chain was still in place. No one had come in. No one had gone out. We checked the rooms. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No open windows. Nothing. Just silence. Dad stayed up with us for the rest of the night. We sat in the living room with the lights on, too scared to go back upstairs. We tried to make sense of it, tried to come up with an explanation, but we couldn't. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, the house was quiet, and for a moment, it almost seemed like it hadn't happened at all. But it did, and we never figured out who or what was knocking that night. I used to stay at my grandma's house a lot when I was a kid. She lived in a small town in an old house that had been in the family for years, the kind of house with creaky floors, thin walls, and a certain stillness at night that made even the smallest sounds feel amplified. It wasn't a bad place, not haunted or run down or anything like that. But after my grandpa died when I was 7, it started to feel different. I don't think I ever noticed it before he passed, or maybe I was just too young to pick up on it. But once he was gone, I started feeling uneasy every time I stayed there. It wasn't one specific thing that scared me. No noises, no shadows, no strange figures in the dark, just this overwhelming sense of something bad inevitably happening there. Like the walls held something that was waiting. Still, I stayed there often. My parents both worked a lot, and my grandma loved having us over, so there were plenty of nights where I managed to push past the weird feeling. Most of the time, I could make it through without my parents having to come pick me up early. I had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night. It happened all the time at home. I would get out of bed, shuffle to my parents' room, and try to see if they would let me in. Most of the time, they didn't. So I would just stand at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness, waiting for something to move. I was an anxious kid. I was always bracing myself for something, even though I had no idea what I was scared of. That habit didn't stop when I stayed at my grandma's. I would still wake up in the middle of the night, still feel that familiar unease, still want to make sure I wasn't alone. And that's exactly what happened one night when I was around 8 years old, about a year after my grandpa had passed. I was sleeping in the guest room upstairs, the one my brother and I always shared when we stayed over. It wasn't a big room, just enough space for 2 twin beds against one wall and a wooden dresser against the other. Across from the beds, there was a small bookshelf, a couple of framed pictures, and a small collection of dolls and crafts my grandma had made or been given over the years. Most of them were harmless, but the 2 that always stood out to me were a pair of Raggedy and Raggedy Andy dolls. I hated them. Something about the way they sat there, always positioned just right, always staring with those same empty black eyes. Their stitched-on smiles. The way their soft fabric limbs looked too human-like in the dim lighting. It wasn't like they had done anything to me. I had just always been uncomfortable with them. The kind of discomfort you can't explain as a kid, but you know is real. That night, I woke up in the dark. At first, I wasn't even scared. Just groggy, disoriented, a little cold. I lay there for a few seconds, listening to the faint creaking of the house, before I decided I needed to use the bathroom. At my grandma's, the bathroom was downstairs, which meant making my way through the hallway, down the old wooden staircase, and past the dark living room to get there. Normally, if I woke up and had to go, I would wake my grandma to come with me. She didn't mind. But to get to her, I had to walk past the bookshelf, past the dolls. I rolled out of bed as quietly as I could, trying not to wake my brother. The room was dark except for the dim glow of a nightlight plugged into the wall near the door, casting long, soft-edged shadows over the furniture. I took a few slow steps toward the hallway, trying not to look at the dolls on the shelf. But something made me stop. I don't know why I turned around. Maybe it was that same anxious habit I had, the one that made me stare down staircases at home, the one that made me brace myself for something. But I turned, and Raggedy and was waving at me. Not just slumped over, not just leaning differently than before. Her entire fabric arm was raised, fingers slightly curled, head tilted to the side as if acknowledging me. I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't like the way a doll normally falls over, stiff and predictable. This was different, deliberate. I stood there frozen, my breath stuck in my throat, trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. But I was. And then I ran. I bolted out of the room so fast I barely felt my feet hit the floor. My body moved before my brain could process what was happening. I didn't think about my brother, didn't stop to check if he was waking up, didn't even bother shutting the door behind me. I just ran straight to my grandma's room, barely able to see in the dark, my hands shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I slipped inside, shutting the door behind me as quietly as I could before diving under the covers. My grandma was already asleep, curled up under a heavy quilt, undisturbed by my panicked entrance. I stayed under the blanket, listening to my own breathing, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my body stiff under the covers, too scared to even peek out. I listened to every sound, every tiny creak of the house settling, every rustle of the wind outside, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I didn't say anything. My brother didn't mention anything weird. When I worked up the courage to go back into the room, Raggedy Ann was sitting exactly where she had always been, her arms limp, her head straight, completely still. It never happened again. I tried to tell myself it was a dream, that my tired, anxious kid brain had conjured up something that wasn't real, that I had imagined it in the darkness, half awake, afraid of nothing, that I had let my fear of the dolls turn into something it wasn't. But I don't believe that. I know what I saw. Even now, 14 years later, I still think about it every time I go upstairs at my grandma's house. Every time I see that doll sitting there on the shelf, exactly the same as it always was. It never moved again. It never did anything else. But I remember, and I always will. A week ago, my stomach's persistent growls reminded me that I had neglected to stock up on groceries. As a typical procrastinating student, I found myself at home alone for 6 days, surviving on instant noodles and stale cereal. The craving for something more substantial became unbearable, so I decided to venture out to the nearby McDonald's drive-thru. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was already 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night. The McDonald's was located across a sprawling commercial district, a labyrinth of interconnected halls housing around 500 stores, entertainment venues like cinemas and go-kart tracks. Normally, this area buzzed with activity, neon lights flickering, and people enjoying the nightlife. However, that night was eerily different. The entire district lay in darkness, an unusual sight that sent a shiver down my spine. As I navigated the desolate streets, my car's headlights sliced through the inky blackness. The familiar hum of city life was replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The absence of streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, making the surroundings feel alien and foreboding. Turning a corner, my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart skipped a beat. The man wore dark tracksuit pants and a matching jacket, with a white sweater peeking out underneath. His attire blended seamlessly with the shadows, making him almost invisible in the dim light. I switched my headlights to high beams, and the scene before me became clearer, yet more horrifying. The man was shambling toward my car with a gait reminiscent of a zombie. Blood smeared his mouth, dripping onto the asphalt with each sluggish step. He was hunched over, clutching his abdomen where a dark, wet stain spread across his clothing. A stab wound, I surmised. Instinctively, I pressed the brake pedal, bringing my car to a halt several meters away from him. My mind raced, torn between the urge to help and the instinct to flee. I cracked my window just enough to communicate, ensuring the doors remained locked. My phone was in my hand, ready to dial emergency services, but I also kept the car in first gear, prepared for a quick getaway if necessary. The man reached the driver's side and leaned heavily against the door, leaving a bloody handprint on the window. His breath fogged the glass as he spoke, his voice thick with an accent I couldn't place. "Drive me to XYZ, he demanded, referring to a notorious district on the city's outskirts, known for its high crime rates and dilapidated buildings. Caught off guard, I stammered. "W what?" His eyes, bloodshot and filled with desperation, locked onto mine. I said, "Drive me to XYZ." His tone grew more aggressive, a mix of pain and urgency. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me, sharpening my senses. Every survival instinct screamed at me to leave. Without uttering another word, I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching against the pavement as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumble backward, his figure shrinking into the darkness. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, knuckles white from the grip. The reality of what had just transpired began to sink in, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I needed to collect myself, so I pulled into the McDonald's parking lot, which was dimly lit by the glow of the drive-through signs. Stepping out of the car, the cool night air hit me, bringing a momentary sense of clarity. I noticed the bloody handprint smeared across the window and specks of blood trailing along the car's side. My stomach churned at the sight. Grabbing a pack of wet wipes from the glove compartment, I meticulously cleaned the stains, my hands shaking with each swipe. As I disposed of the soiled wipes, a thought crossed my mind. Should I contact the police? The logical part of me knew it was the right thing to do, but another part hesitated. In this city, involving the authorities often led to more complications than resolutions. Anonymous tips were rarely anonymous, and I didn't want to become entangled in a situation I barely understood. Deciding to push the incident to the back of my mind, I proceeded to the drive-thru. The familiar menu board offered a semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos of the night. I placed my order, the routine interaction providing a brief respite from my racing thoughts. As I waited for my food, I glanced toward the nearby bus stop, illuminated by a solitary, flickering street lamp. My breath caught in my throat. There, under the wavering light, was the same man, his posture slouched, one hand clutching his side. He seemed oblivious to his surroundings, eyes fixed on the ground. 5 minutes felt like an eternity as I watched him from the safety of my car. The drive-thru attendant handed me my order, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the night's events. I muttered a thanks, my attention never wavering from the figure at the bus stop. Just as I contemplated my next move, a taxi pulled up to the curb. The man lifted his head, a look of relief washing over his features. He shuffled toward the cab, leaving a faint trail of blood droplets in his wake. The driver stepped out, a look of concern crossing his face as he helped the injured man into the back seat. The taxi's taillights disappeared into the distance, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Questions swirled in my mind. Who was he? What had happened to him? Why did he insist on going to XYZ? The night's events replayed in my head, each detail etched into my memory. I drove home in a daze, the adrenaline fading, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. The city's silence felt heavier now, the darkness more oppressive. As I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than I could comprehend. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of the bloodied man haunting my thoughts. The craving for a simple meal had led me into a nightmarish encounter, one that left me with more questions than answers. In the days that followed, I scoured the news for any reports of a stabbing or a disturbance in the area, but found nothing. It was as if the man had vanished, his existence erased from the city's narrative. Life around me continued as usual, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease. The experience became a grim reminder of the city's underbelly, the unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. It made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. And though the memory of that night began to fade with time, the lessons it imparted remained etched in my consciousness, a testament to the thin veil between normalcy and the unknown. It had rained that evening, one of those summer showers that hit hard and fast, leaving behind thick humidity and the smell of damp earth. I'd been sitting inside my garage apartment, feeling restless, and decided it was a good time to sweep the carport deck. It wasn't a place I spent much time. It felt exposed, not unsafe exactly, but just not somewhere I wanted to be for long. It was sturdy enough to stand on, though, and after the rain, I figured it would be easier to sweep away the leaves and whatever else had blown in. I grabbed the broom and stepped out, the boards slightly damp under my feet. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and everything around me seemed amplified. The smell of wet wood, the distant hum of cicadas starting back up after the rain, the occasional drip of water from the roof. I worked quickly, not bothering to enjoy the fresh air, just wanting to get it done. The wet debris clumped together, making the job easier, but I still moved fast, my hands gripping the broom tightly. I just wanted to finish and go back inside. After about 10 minutes, I was done. I knocked the broom against the railing to shake off whatever dirt had clung to the bristles and stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I wiped my hands on my shorts, glanced back out the window at the dark deck, and then shut the lights off. It was still warm in my apartment, but the rain had cooled the air just enough that it felt like a good night to leave the windows open. I climbed into bed, stretched out, and listened to the sound of the night outside. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Midnight, maybe later. At first, I wasn't even fully awake, just aware of a strange sound. Something buzzing, a soft but persistent hum. It wasn't my phone, not an alarm, nothing familiar. My eyes stayed closed for a few more seconds, my brain struggling to pull itself from sleep. Then I felt it. Something brushed against my cheek. I shot upright so fast that my head spun. There was something on my arm. Crawling. Legs. Small, skittering legs. I slapped at it instinctively, my hand hitting something solid but light. It fell away, but then I felt another one, and another. The buzzing got louder. I fumbled for the lamp beside my bed, my fingers shaking as I flipped the switch. The second the light came on, my stomach dropped. The walls, the floor, the windows, cockroaches. Not just a few, not just a handful, hundreds. They streamed in through the windows, moving over the screens like they weren't even there, as if they were flowing in with the night air. Their bodies glistened in the light, dark and wet-looking, wings twitching, legs moving. Some were flying, hitting the walls, the ceiling, the floor with soft thuds. The noise filled the room, a nightmare chorus of buzzing wings and skittering feet. I couldn't breathe. One landed on my leg, another on my shoulder. They were on the bed, on my clothes, in my hair. I felt them moving against my skin, their tiny legs gripping, their bodies brushing against me. I screamed. Not a yell, not a shout, a full, raw, panic scream. My body moved before my mind could catch up, instinct kicking in as I scrambled off the bed, slapping at myself, trying to get them off. My feet hit the floor, but the second I moved, they moved too. They were everywhere. I ran, out of the apartment, through the door, down the steps barefoot, barely aware of anything but the overwhelming need to get away. I kept slapping at my arms, my legs, convinced they were still on me. I could still feel them crawling. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, panting, my skin burning from where I'd hit myself over and over. My chest heaved, my breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. The street was empty, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic, the occasional chirp of a cricket. I stood there for what felt like forever, still shaking, still brushing at my arms even though I knew they were gone. My body itched all over. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I had no idea what to do. Eventually, I forced myself to stop, to breathe, to think. I was standing outside in the middle of the night in nothing but shorts and a t-shirt, my feet bare, my skin clammy with sweat. My apartment was just up the street, but the thought of going back inside made my stomach twist. I waited. An hour, maybe two. I paced. I scratched at my arms, even though there was nothing there. I checked myself 100 times over, convinced I'd find one still clinging to me. When the first hint of sunrise started to lighten the sky, I forced myself to go back. My heart pounded as I reached the door, my hand hesitating over the knob. I wasn't ready, but I had to. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking. The light from outside filtered in, casting long shadows across the floor. My stomach clenched, my throat dry as I stepped inside. Nothing, not a single roach. The floor was empty. The walls were clean. The bed was untouched, the blankets crumpled from where I had left them. The windows were still open, the screens still in place. There was no sign of them. It was like they had never been there. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my skin crawling, waiting for something to move, for something to prove I hadn't lost my mind. But there was nothing. The only sound was the quiet rustling of the trees outside, the distant chirping of birds waking up. I didn't sleep in that apartment for 2 nights after that. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Every time I tried to relax, I felt them on me again, legs skittering, wings buzzing. Even now, years later, I still remember it. The sound, the feeling, the panic. I never left my windows open again. I was about 3 months away from leaving my job at the children's hospital when this happened. I had already put in my notice, but I was still working full-time in inpatient psych, doing long shifts, covering nights more often than I liked. By that point, I had seen a lot. Kids coming in beaten so badly their bones were still healing. Kids who had been assaulted by family members. Kids who had been neglected, abandoned, starved, used. A lot of them had no real chance from the start. Some of them were so young that the only way they knew how to react to anything was violence. There was one boy who stuck with me more than most. He wasn't my patient, but I had read his file. He was maybe 10 or 11, but he looked smaller. Had been through hell, years of physical and sexual abuse. His records were bad, not just because of what had happened to him, but because of how he responded to it. He had been placed in and out of different facilities, kicked out of a few, labeled as a major behavior risk. He had trouble following instructions. He acted out sexually, aggressively, violently. You had to watch him closely, because when he wanted to, he could be very manipulative. Some of the nurses had sympathy for him. Others were just tired. One night, before the shift I'm thinking about, he had gone completely out of control. I wasn't there for it, but I heard about it when I came in the next day. Somehow, he had gotten hold of a chain, and he wasn't just playing with it. He was swinging it like a weapon, fighting his way through the unit, trying to escape. A nurse and a psych tech had managed to corner him down a hallway. They were able to disarm him, but it had been a real struggle. He could have seriously hurt someone, maybe even killed someone, if he had gotten lucky with a swing. A couple of nights after that, I was working at the front reception area, setting up charts, checking the security cameras, buzzing people in and out. It was late, and things were mostly quiet, aside from the usual noises you'd expect. The staff talking in the hall, doors opening and closing, the occasional crying from a room down the hall. I wasn't really thinking about anything. I was just getting through my shift, staring at the same paperwork I had done 100 times before. The boy was still there. He hadn't been discharged yet. And that night, he was in one of his moods, full of energy, full of anger, testing every boundary he could find. The staff had been trying to settle him down, but nothing worked. He was on a rampage, yelling, knocking things over, picking fights. They put him in timeout, which was just a small, padded room meant to give kids a space to calm down. But we couldn't lock him in. That was a rule. So he kept running out, causing more trouble, getting put back in, then running out again. I was sitting behind the high reception counter, writing something down, when I heard movement behind me. I froze. Patients weren't allowed back there. It was a secured area. No one should have been behind me. I turned around, and there he was, standing right there in the enclosed space with me. His eyes were wild, unfocused, glazed over, almost feverish. He was breathing hard, like he had been running. There was sweat on his face. His hands were clenched into fists, but they were trembling, like he couldn't hold them still. I don't know how long he had been standing there before I noticed him. My first instinct was to back away. I stood up, moving slowly, like I was trying not to startle a wild animal. I remember it vividly, even though decades have passed since that day. I was 7 or 8 years old, a time when the world felt vast and full of possibilities. After school, I often went over to my friend Tom's house. He lived on a quiet street, the kind where everyone knew each other, and children played freely without a care. Tom's house had a large backyard that seamlessly blended into a dense forest. Those woods were our playground, a realm of adventure and imagination. One crisp autumn afternoon, Tom and I decided it was the perfect day to build a tree fort. The idea had been brewing for weeks, and our young minds were filled with grand designs of secret hideouts and lookout towers. We gathered all the tools we thought we'd need: hammers, nails, a handsaw, and a collection of old wooden planks Tom's dad had discarded. Tom's little brother, Jake, who was about 5, insisted on joining us. Despite our initial reluctance, we allowed him to tag along, thinking he could help in some minor ways. Before setting out, we had a brief discussion about the recent coyote sightings in the area. There had been talks among the neighborhood adults about these animals venturing closer to human homes during the day. The thought made us uneasy, but in our youthful bravado, we armed ourselves with the hammers, convinced we could fend off any wild animal that dared approach. The path into the woods was well trodden, a familiar route we'd taken countless times. The trees stood tall, their leaves a mosaic of reds, oranges, and yellows, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the distant calls of birds preparing for their migration. As we walked, our conversation was lighthearted. Tom and I talked about where we'd position the fort, how high it should be, and the secret signals we'd use. Jake trailed behind, occasionally stopping to pick up interesting stones or to examine peculiar-looking mushrooms. The forest, usually so inviting, seemed different that day, quieter, as if holding its breath. About 15 minutes into our walk, the atmosphere shifted. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds faded, replaced by an almost tangible silence. It was Jake who first sensed something was amiss. He stopped abruptly, his small frame rigid, eyes wide with fear. Tom and I, engrossed in our plans, nearly bumped into him. Following Jake's gaze, we looked ahead and saw her. Approximately 25 yards in front of us stood an elderly woman, possibly in her late 70s. Her grayish-white hair was wild and curly, cascading down to her shoulders. She wore a long white gown that seemed out of place in the middle of the woods. But what struck me the most was her demeanor. She stood utterly still, not acknowledging our presence, her eyes fixed on something beyond us, as if staring into a different realm. A shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced, trying to rationalize her presence. Perhaps she was lost or confused. Maybe she was someone's grandmother who had wandered away. But deep down, an inexplicable fear took root. The three of us stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The woman remained motionless, her gaze unwavering. Then slowly, she raised her right arm and pointed back along the path we had come. It was a deliberate, almost mechanical movement, as if directing us to leave. Panic surged through us. Without a word, we dropped everything, the tools, the wood, our plans for the fort, and ran. The forest, which once felt like a second home, now seemed like a maze of looming shadows and unseen threats. Branches scratched at our arms and faces as we sprinted back, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Bursting out of the woods, we didn't stop until we reached Tom's backyard. His mother was there, tending to her garden. Seeing our pale faces and frantic demeanor, she rushed over, concern etched on her face. We tried to explain what we had seen, our words tumbling over each other. But to her, it sounded like an overactive imagination fueled by the recent coyote stories. She dismissed our account, attributing it to childish fantasies. For days, the image of the woman haunted me. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it was filled with dreams of being lost in the woods, the woman's figure always in the distance. Tom and Jake experienced similar disturbances. We avoided the forest after that, our previous sanctuary now a place of unease. Years later, as adults, we revisited that day, each of us recalling the same vivid details. The memory remained as clear as ever, a shared experience that bonded us in its mystery. We never found an explanation for the woman's presence. She became an enigma, a ghost of our past that reminded us of the thin veil between the known and the unknown. Even now, as I recount this story, I can see her in my mind's eye, the woman in white, standing silently among the trees, pointing us away from some unseen danger, or perhaps guiding us back to safety. The woods have since been cleared for new housing developments, but the memory of that day remains untouched, a lingering whisper of a mystery that may never be solved. I stepped outside my mom's house and stretched, feeling the crisp autumn air against my skin. The Santa Ana winds had started early that year, whipping through the neighborhood, shaking the trees, and sending dry leaves skittering across the pavement. I had been staying over more often lately, visiting when I had the time. My mom's neighborhood was nice, quiet, full of neatly trimmed lawns and well-kept houses. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. Across the street, the neighbor's kid was in the yard. He was always out there, tall for his age, lanky, moving in an odd, slow way as he played with his ball. I'd seen him plenty of times before when I came to visit. He was autistic, around 12 years old, and always under the watchful eye of his caregiver. He never seemed to say much. I had never really spoken to him before, just seen him from a distance, running back and forth across the grass, or tossing his ball up in the air. That day, though, was different. As I stepped off the porch, I noticed him standing near my car. He was staring at it, not in a casual way, but fixated, his head tilted slightly. I slowed my steps, watching him as he moved around the car, his eyes locked on the underside. He wasn't touching it, just circling, stepping carefully, like he was searching for something. I walked toward him and followed his gaze. His ball had rolled underneath, settling just beyond reach. I sighed, crouched down, and reached under to grab it. The asphalt was warm against my palm as I stretched my fingers, dragging the ball toward me. When I finally got it, I dusted it off and stood, turning to hand it to him. He didn't take it right away. His hands were hanging limply at his sides, and for a second, I wasn't sure he even noticed me. Then slowly, his arms rose, and his long fingers wrapped around the ball. His skin was cold. That's when he looked up at me. His head tilted a little more, his mouth slightly open. His eyes were vacant, almost too wide, like he was seeing straight through me. I gave him an awkward smile, unsure what else to do, and turned to walk back into the house. As I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there. He hadn't moved. He was just standing on the curb, holding the ball against his chest, staring at me. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, locking it behind me. Later that night, I told my girlfriend about what had happened over the phone. She thought it was cute, said he probably wanted to say thank you, but didn't know how. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking it. But something about the way he had looked at me, how empty his expression had been, made my stomach twist. That night, I stayed over at my mom's. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees, sending loose branches tumbling across the road. The Santa Ana winds always made everything feel restless, uneasy. Around 2 in the morning, I sat in my old bedroom. The dim glow of my laptop screened the only light in the room. Outside, I heard the wind whip against the house, then the sound of something rolling down the street. Probably a trash can knocked over. Then, the house alarm beeped. Beep beep. Front door open. I froze. The wind. It had to be the wind. If the door wasn't latched properly, the pressure could push it open. It had happened before. Still, I hesitated before standing up. The hallway outside my room was pitch black. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers brushing against the wall until I found it. I flicked it on, and there he was, at the top of the staircase, standing completely still, staring at me. My breath caught in my throat. He was barefoot, his arms hanging at his sides, his head tilted to the same angle as before, mouth slightly open. Those same wide, empty eyes. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I felt frozen, like if I moved too quickly, something would happen. I didn't know what, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay still. Then, finally, I swallowed and took a step forward. My hands were shaking as I reached out. His fingers were ice cold as I took his hand. His skin felt strange, soft, but too thin, like there was barely anything between my palm and his bones. I led him down the stairs. Each step creaked under our weight, the sound too loud in the silent house. The front door was still open, the wind pushing against it, making it shudder. I guided him outside, stepping into the cold night air. Across the street, his front door was open too. The house was dark, completely silent. No lights, no movement. I hesitated, then walked him inside. The air inside the house was thick, still. I didn't go past the doorway. I just stepped far enough in to make sure he was inside, then turned and hurried back to my mom's house. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, then 3 times. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. The next morning, I told my mom what had happened. She frowned, concerned, and said she would talk to the neighbors. Later that afternoon, she knocked on their door. When they answered, I stood a few steps back, watching. She spoke to them for a few minutes. The caregiver looked confused, shook her head. My mom turned back to me, her expression shifting. "He was asleep all night," she said. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "No, he wasn't," I said. But she just shook her head again. The caregiver insisted. The boy had been in his room the whole night. She had checked on him multiple times. There was no way he could have left the house. I didn't argue. I just stood there, staring past them into the darkened hallway of their house. I didn't see the boy. I never saw him again after that. I was 16 when it happened. It was late in the evening, not quite night, but dark enough outside that the world beyond my bedroom window had dissolved into a solid black void. The only light in the room came from the small lamp on my bedside table, casting a weak yellow glow over the pages of the book I was reading. I don't remember exactly what the book was, only that I had been engrossed in it for hours, lying on my stomach, chin propped on my hand, turning pages without really noticing how much time was passing. At some point, I started to feel hungry. That dull, empty sensation in my stomach crept in, making me realize I hadn't eaten in a while. I blinked, sighing as I shifted onto my side and let the book fall closed beside me. I wasn't in the mood to get up, but I knew I would have to eventually. I ran my hand over my face, rubbing my eyes, and then, for no real reason, I decided to lie down again. The moment my head touched the pillow, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a strange weightlessness in my limbs, like the way your body feels right before you fall asleep. But instead of drifting off, the sensation grew stronger, spreading through my chest, my arms, my legs, until I no longer felt the bed beneath me. My body was light, so light that for a moment I thought I was dreaming. Then, in the next instant, I knew I wasn't, because I was standing in the doorway, watching it happen. It was impossible, yet there I was, staring across the room at myself, lying in bed with my eyes closed, my chest rising and falling steadily. And above the bed, hovering just over a foot in the air, was me, the floating me. I felt nothing, no panic, no fear, no emotion at all. I just watched, cold and detached, as the me in the air began to turn, slowly spinning, tilting at an angle before I even realized I was moving. The room around me was the same as it had always been. The posters on the walls, the bookshelves stacked unevenly with old paperbacks, the small wooden desk pushed against the far wall with crumpled papers and a half-empty glass of water sitting on top. Everything was the same, except for me. From the doorway, I could see it happening so much clearer. The slow, gradual way my floating self was twisting in the air. The way my arms were limp, my legs relaxed, as though I was unconscious. The way I continued to turn until I was completely upside down. And that's when I saw it. The face. My own face, staring back at me. The me on the bed was still. My features were calm, my breathing deep and steady. But then, as if sensing something, my eyes snapped open. And for a fraction of a second, all three of me existed in the same moment. The floating me, suspended in midair, upside down, staring directly into the eyes of the me still lying on the bed. The me in the doorway, silent, watching. And then, the floating me fell. It was a sudden, jarring motion, like a puppet with its strings cut. There was no sound, no impact, just the feeling of weightlessness vanishing in an instant as the floating me collapsed back into the me on the bed. The moment they touched, everything shifted. I was no longer in the doorway. I was back in my body. And for the briefest moment, I felt something deep inside of me recoil. Something that didn't want to be pulled back in. Something that wanted to scream. But then it was gone. And all that was left was me, lying in my bed, blinking up at the ceiling, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move at first. My limbs felt heavy, the exact opposite of the weightlessness I had just experienced. I was grounded, solid, real. The feeling of my mattress beneath me was so reassuring, so normal, that for a split second I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't, because I remembered standing in the doorway. I remembered watching it happen. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at the spot where I had been standing. The doorway was empty now, nothing but darkness beyond the frame. The same doorway I had walked through countless times. But now it felt different, like something had been there, like something had watched me back. My skin crawled. I forced myself to sit up, my muscles sluggish and stiff. The room was silent, too silent. I could hear the faint hum of the house settling, the occasional creak of the floorboards, but something about it felt off. It took me a moment to realize why. The book I had been reading was gone. I froze. I had dropped it right beside me. I was sure of it. But the bed was empty. I glanced at the floor, thinking maybe it had fallen off the edge, but it wasn't there either. It was just gone. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't understand what had happened, not fully. But something inside me told me I shouldn't think about it too much. That if I tried to make sense of it, I wouldn't like the answer. I swallowed hard and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. My body still felt strange, like I wasn't completely settled in it, like something was slightly out of sync. I took a slow breath, pressing my palms against my legs, trying to ground myself. I needed to move. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and took a few steps toward the doorway. I wasn't sure why, maybe to prove to myself that there was nothing there, that I was still in control. But as I reached the threshold, a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease washed over me. It felt wrong, like stepping into a space I didn't belong in. I hesitated, staring out into the dark hallway. I had walked through this doorway hundreds, maybe thousands of times. But at that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stepped through it now, something would change. That I wouldn't be the same. That maybe I wasn't the same already. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. And then very slowly, I stepped back. I turned away from the doorway, my skin prickling, and crawled back into bed. I didn't bother turning off the lamp. I pulled the blanket over myself, curled onto my side, and shut my eyes. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, everything was normal. The book was back on my bedside table, right where I had left it. The room felt like my room again. The feeling from the night before was gone, replaced with the usual morning grogginess. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had just been a dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Because ever since that night, whenever I walk past my bedroom doorway, I get the strangest feeling, like something is still standing there, watching. It was one of those nights where the house felt too quiet. The kind of silence that made the sound of my own breathing feel loud. I was 12, sitting cross-legged on the couch, the glow of the old boxy television, the only light in the living room. The volume was turned low so I wouldn't wake my parents, but the flickering images of the X-Files episode 1 had been watching were burned into my brain. The one where the guy had cockroaches crawling under his skin. I should have known better than to watch that kind of thing so late at night, especially when I was already jumpy about the dark. But I did it anyway. Outside, the storm had started to roll in. The wind rattled the windows, and every so often, the sky flashed white, shadows stretching across the walls in strange, warped shapes. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the TV, but I wasn't really watching anymore. My hands felt clammy, my stomach a little tight. I turned off the television, its static glow flickering out, leaving me alone with the storm. I walked to the stairs, my socks soft against the wood, and made my way up to my room. I should have felt safe in my bed, but something about the night felt off. The wind howled outside, and thunder rumbled deep in the distance, the kind that you could feel in your chest. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, trying to push the thoughts of cockroaches and crawling things out of my head. But instead of calming down, my mind drifted to something worse. Aliens. I had always been afraid of them. Not the little green ones from cartoons, but the gray ones. The ones with long limbs and huge, black, soulless eyes. The ones that showed up in the dead of night, taking people while they slept. It was a stupid fear, I knew that, but as I lay there in the dim light of my bedroom, it didn't feel stupid. It felt real. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I must have at some point because the next thing I knew, I was dreaming. Except it didn't feel like a dream. I was lying flat on my back, cold metal underneath me. My arms and legs wouldn't move, like they were strapped down, but I couldn't feel anything holding them. My chest rose and fell too quickly, panic clawing at my throat. The air smelled sterile, like a hospital, but something about it was wrong. Too clean, too sharp. There was a bright white light above me, so intense that I couldn't see beyond it. And then shapes, moving in the light. Tall, thin. I couldn't breathe. The figures moved closer, their smooth, gray skin almost blending into the brightness, but I could see them. Large, black, empty eyes. Small, slit-like mouths that never moved. Their fingers were long and unnatural, and as they reached toward me, I tried to scream. Nothing came out. Then, I woke up, but I didn't jolt upright. I didn't gasp for breath. I just opened my eyes, like I had never been asleep at all. For a second, I didn't know where I was. My heart was hammering, my skin damp with sweat. Then I realized I was in my bed, in my room. The storm was still going outside, the wind howling, but something was wrong. The light. It was still there. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ceiling. It wasn't the same light as my dream, but it was close. It filtered through my curtains, casting long, glowing beams across my walls. And then, boom, a massive explosion of sound rattled the entire house, shaking the walls, the floor, even the bed under me. My chest locked up, a deep pressure settling in my bones. The light flared, so bright that for a moment, it was like daylight had flooded my room. And then, just as fast as it came, it was gone. I didn't think. I moved. Throwing off my blankets, I stumbled to my window, my hands shaking as I pulled back the curtains. The sky was dark, but something still glowed outside, something flickering. My eyes followed the light, down toward my neighbor's yard. Their tree. The massive paperbark tree that had stood there for years was split down the middle, a deep blackened wound running through it. Embers floated in the air like fireflies, glowing orange against the night. Smoke curled up toward the sky, the bark still burning in places. Lightning, I thought. It had to be lightning. But my chest felt tight, my head spinning. I turned from the window and walked toward the balcony door. My body felt strange, like I was moving without fully thinking about it. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, the wooden planks of the balcony cold under my bare feet. The tree looked worse from here, split clean apart. The way the light still flickered through the drifting embers made my stomach knot up. I gripped the railing, trying to steady myself, but my mind was racing. I had been dreaming, but I had woken up before the boom, before the flash of light, like I had been dropped back into my bed. I shook my head. No, that was stupid, impossible. But my fingers dug into the railing, my breath coming too fast. I glanced up at the sky. The storm clouds were still there, but something about them looked off. They felt too still. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step back inside. My room was exactly how I left it. My blanket was still thrown back, my pillow slightly dented where my head had been. The clock on my nightstand read 12:04 a.m. Only a few minutes had passed. I sat down on the edge of my bed, my hands gripping the sheets. My legs felt weak, my stomach twisting itself into knots. It was just a dream. It had to be. The lightning strike was a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been somewhere else, that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to, and that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been dreaming at all. My junior year of college, I moved into a big old house with a bunch of other students. For people lived on the first floor, 5 of us on the second, and there were 2 people on the third floor, though we barely saw them. The house itself looked normal enough. A little rundown, sure, with creaky floors and outdated fixtures, but that was to be expected. It had character, as people like to say. At first, everything seemed fine. We all settled into our rooms, got used to the little quirks of the place, the way the front door stuck in humid weather, the way the pipes rattled when you turned on the shower. There was only one part of the house that none of us really used, the basement. It wasn't like anyone had said it was off limits, but there wasn't much reason to go down there. There was an old washing machine and dryer that had been broken since before we moved in. The landlord never bothered to replace them, and we just went to a laundromat down the street. The basement was mostly just used for parties when we didn't want to trash the main living space. But the one thing about the basement that always unsettled me was the locked room in the back. It wasn't a normal room, more like a storage space with a heavy, old wooden door. And something about it just felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every time I went down there, even just to grab something someone had left behind after a party, I felt this creeping sense of unease. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. It was a basement, after all, dark, musty, a little damp. But then, one of my roommates told me something that made the feeling worse. Apparently, when my roommates first moved in, before I had gotten there, that door wasn't locked. One of the girls had been poking around and decided to take a look inside. What she found freaked her out so badly that she never went down there again. She said there were human teeth on the floor. Not just 1 or 2, but several, scattered like someone had dropped them. And alongside them were these strange tools. She couldn't describe them well, just that they looked old and sharp, the kind of thing you wouldn't expect to find in a college rental house. Not long after that, the landlord came by, locked the door, and never spoke about it. That was months ago, and by the time I moved in, the room was sealed shut. Nobody brought it up much. We joked about it sometimes, but deep down, it wasn't really funny. We all just avoided the basement, unless we had to go down there. One night, I had just woken up from a nap. It was late afternoon, still light outside, but that weird in-between time where the house was quieter than usual. Most of my roommates were either at class or out somewhere. I was hungry, so I went to the kitchen to make some food. I was alone on my floor, or at least I thought I was. As I was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pan, the hallway light to my left suddenly turned off. Just a quick flick, like someone had hit the switch. I frowned, but didn't think much of it. Light bulbs burn out all the time. Then, a few seconds later, the light came back on. That got my attention. The switch for that light wasn't even in the hallway. It was in the stairwell, on the other side of a closed door. Someone had to be standing there, flipping it. I stood still waiting. A minute passed. The light turned off again. That was enough for me. I ran over to the stairwell door, yanked it open, expecting to catch someone messing with me. But the stairwell was empty. I stepped down a few stairs and looked around. Nobody. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator back in the kitchen. I walked all the way down to the first floor, just to be sure. The living room and common areas were empty. I checked the front door locked. Now, I was unsettled, but I still told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe there was some kind of electrical issue. Maybe the wiring in this old house was faulty. So I went back upstairs, back to my food. Almost immediately, the light flicked on and off again. I froze. This time, I didn't move right away. I just stood there, staring at the light, waiting to see if it would happen again. That's when the music started. It was coming from the living room, right next to the kitchen. A loud, sudden burst of sound, like someone had just hit play on a stereo. For a second, I felt relief. Someone else was home, after all. That had to be it. One of my roommates must have come in without me noticing, playing a joke. or just listening to music. I stepped into the living room. There was a laptop sitting on a ledge near the window, connected to speakers. The screen was closed. The music was blaring from the speakers. The television was on too, but it wasn't on any channel. Just static, the kind you only see in old horror movies. I stared at the laptop. It wasn't on. I slowly reached for the speakers and unplugged them. The music stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I could feel my heartbeat, slow and heavy in my chest. I turned off the stove, grabbed my keys, and walked out of the house without even bothering to turn off the lights. I got in my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to be away. For the next few hours, I just wandered around town, sitting in parking lots, going through drive-thrus just to kill time. When I finally worked up the nerve to go home, the house was back to normal. The lights were on, people were there, the TV was off. Nobody mentioned anything. I didn't bring it up right away. A few weeks later, I finally told my roommates about it. I was expecting someone to admit to messing with me, to say it was just a prank. But instead, the whole room got quiet. Then, one by one, they started sharing their own stories. One girl said she often woke up in the middle of the night to hear noises in her closet. Not just random creaks, actual movement. And sometimes, her hangers would be swaying like something had just bumped into them. Another guy said he constantly heard footsteps above his room when nobody was supposed to be home. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth. Then another guy told us something worse. He said he had woken up in the middle of the night once, just randomly, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a dark figure standing in the middle of our kitchen. It wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. It was just staring in the direction of his room. He blinked, and it was gone. After that, nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. We all just sort of sat there, knowing none of us had been imagining things, but not wanting to admit what that meant. None of us moved out early, but the house never felt right after that. We stopped having parties in the basement. We stopped staying up late in the living room alone, and none of us ever went near that locked door in the basement again. It was a warm evening in August when my brother and I were getting ready for our road trip to Canada. We had spent the last few days packing, making lists, and double-checking everything we needed. The plan was to leave early the next morning, but as always, there were a few last-minute things we had forgotten. So, just before the sun started setting, we got in the car and headed to the store. The air was thick and humid, the kind of summer heat that clings to your skin even when the sun isn't directly on you. The sky was clear, just beginning to turn that deep blue before dusk. The roads weren't too busy yet, just the usual evening traffic, people coming home from work, others heading out for dinner or errands like us. We were about halfway to the store when we saw the little white dog. At first, we didn't think much of it. Around here, people don't always leash their dogs, and it's not uncommon to see them wandering a bit before heading back to their yards. He was trotting along the sidewalk, tail wagging, ears perked up, like he didn't have a care in the world. Someone's letting their dog roam again, I thought, glancing at him as we drove past. We got to the store and took our time grabbing what we needed. Just basic things, snacks for the trip, a couple of travel-sized toiletries we forgot, some drinks for the road. It wasn't a long trip, but we still wanted to be prepared. The store was a little crowded, which made the whole errand take longer than expected. By the time we finally checked out and got back to the car, the sun was lower in the sky, the streetlights just starting to flicker on. On the way home, as we turned down a busier street, we saw him again. This time, something was different. The little dog was much farther from where we had first seen him, and now he was on the edge of the road, close to the traffic. My stomach tensed. He wasn't just wandering anymore, he was lost. There was no one around, no owner in sight. Just this small white dog, weaving near the curb, getting dangerously close to the cars passing by. We both knew what we had to do. I pulled over quickly, barely taking the time to check my mirrors before easing the car onto the shoulder. The second I put it in park, I was out the door, whistling toward the dog, trying to get his attention before he stepped any closer to the traffic. For a second, he looked at me. His ears perked up again, his little tail wagging like he thought we were playing a game. Then, instead of coming toward me, he bolted in the opposite direction. My heart dropped. I didn't chase him. I knew better than to make him run faster, but the panic was setting in. I turned back toward the car, about to tell my brother we needed another plan when I heard his voice. Oh shit, he's crossing. I barely had time to turn before it happened. The dog shot out into the street, his small body a blur of white against the pavement. My brother had run across to try and cut him off, but the dog dodged him at the last second, darting between the lanes. Then, an SUV. It happened so fast that I almost didn't process it. The dog was there, and then he wasn't. The sound, was something I'll never forget. A sickening, wet thud, followed by a high-pitched yelp that cut off almost as soon as it started. The driver didn't even slow down, just kept going like nothing had happened. I couldn't move for a second. The world felt like it had paused, like time had frozen, like my brain refused to accept what I had just seen. Then I forced myself forward. My legs felt heavy, my stomach twisted in knots, but I had to move. The little dog was lying in the street, his whole lower half crushed, his fur stained dark on the pavement. He wasn't struggling, wasn't whining. He was completely still, his body frozen in that one final moment of pain. I picked him up without thinking. His body was still warm, but limp, like all the life had drained out of him the second the car hit. My hands shook as I carried him back to the car, barely able to breathe, barely able to think. We got in and closed the doors, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a physical thing. The tags. We needed to find the owner. I fumbled with them, my fingers unsteady as I turned the little metal pieces to read the engraved numbers. A name, an address, a phone number. The address wasn't far, just a couple of blocks away. We drove in silence. The car felt too quiet, too small, too heavy with what had just happened. The smell of blood lingered in the air, faint but impossible to ignore. I kept my eyes forward, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My brother sat stiffly beside me, staring out the window. Then we were there. A small house with a well-kept yard, a porch light glowing softly in the dim evening light. I swallowed hard, forcing myself out of the car, forcing myself to walk up the driveway with the small, lifeless body in my arms. Knocking felt wrong, but I did it anyway. 3 short raps against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The door opened, and everything got worse. The woman who answered was older, maybe in her late 50s or early 60s. She had short, graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. A smile that faded instantly when she saw what I was holding. I couldn't even get the words out. Didn't have to. She knew. The sound she made, it wasn't a scream, not really. It was more of a wail, raw and broken, a sound of grief so deep that it felt like it reached into my bones. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the porch, her hands covering her mouth, her whole body shaking. I wanted to say something, anything, but what do you say? There was nothing that could fix this, nothing that could make it better. I placed the dog gently on the ground beside her. She reached out with trembling hands, stroking his fur, whispering his name over and over, as if saying it enough times might bring him back. My throat was tight, my eyes burning. I looked away, staring at the empty street, the headlights of passing cars, the world moving on like nothing had happened. Eventually, we left. There was nothing more we could do. The drive home was silent. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The trip to Canada still happened the next day, but it didn't feel the same. The excitement was dulled, the anticipation replaced by something heavier. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dog. The way he ran, the way he looked back at me, the way he froze after the car hit, the way his owner crumbled when she realized he was gone. I don't know why we saw him twice that night. I don't know why he was so far from home, or why he ran the way he did. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget him. I am not a superstitious person by any stretch of the imagination. I don't believe in ghosts, omens, or anything supernatural. But what happened to me last night, I swear every word of it is true. It started with a nightmare. I was walking down a street in my city, the kind of place I pass through every day, lined with old buildings, dim streetlights, and the occasional flicker of neon signs from late-night businesses. The air was thick and humid, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin even in the dead of night. I was alone, just wandering, when a stranger passed by and muttered something to me. His voice was low, garbled, like he was speaking through water. I stopped, turning toward him, and asked him to repeat himself. He stepped closer. His face was shadowed under the hood of a ratty old jacket, but his hands were steady as they reached for me. Before I could react, I felt a sharp prick in my arm. My body locked up, everything inside me going rigid as a wave of cold numbness flooded through my veins. My vision blurred, my legs gave out, and I hit the pavement hard. Then darkness. I woke up somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. The air was thick with a choking, sulfuric smell. My arms and legs were bound, stretched tight. My skin was raw, burning as if I had been scraped down to the nerve. In the dim red glow of flickering torchlight, I saw shapes moving, tall, twisted figures with elongated limbs, their eyes like burning embers. They were laughing. Their voices slithered through the air like smoke, whispering things I couldn't understand, words that scratched at my skull. I tried to pull away, tried to scream, but my throat was raw, and the only sound that came out was a ragged breath. One of them moved closer, dragging something behind it, a curved, jagged blade. "There is no escape," they said, their voices overlapping, a chorus of cruel amusement. "There is no escape." I fought. I pulled against the restraints until my muscles burned, until the cold steel dug deep into my skin. The laughter rose, echoing all around me. I felt the first cut, white-hot pain splitting me open like paper. Ding-dong. The sound cut through everything. Sharp, crisp. A doorbell. Ding-dong. My eyes snapped open. I was in my room, drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I sat up too fast, the room spinning for a moment before settling back into place. Ding-dong. Not in the dream. In real life. I froze. I live alone. It was 5 in the morning. Who the hell would be at my door? I turned to look at my phone on the nightstand. No missed calls, no messages. The doorbell rang again. I swallowed the tight knot of fear rising in my throat and forced myself to move. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, my hands shaking slightly as I switched it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness as I made my way down the hall, my bare feet cold against the floor. The apartment felt different, heavier, like the air had thickened. Every step felt too loud. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. The small window in the door let in just enough of the outside light for me to see that the porch was empty. I stood there for a long moment, staring through the glass, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to open the door. It was raining outside. Just a light drizzle, but enough to make the pavement glisten under the streetlights. The street itself was empty. Not a car, not a single person in sight. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, no movement at all. I stood there for what felt like minutes, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the doorbell didn't ring again. Maybe it was a malfunction. Maybe it had been some stupid prank, though the idea of someone standing outside at 5 in the morning in the rain, just to ring a random doorbell, didn't make sense. But still, no one was there. I let out a breath, trying to shake the uneasy feeling clinging to me, and turned back toward the stairs. Ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong. The sound exploded through the air, rapid and urgent. My stomach dropped. I spun back around, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached the door in seconds, throwing myself against it, peering through the glass. The porch was still empty. My breath was coming too fast now, my skin crawling with the kind of fear that had no explanation. I stepped back, flipping the switch that turned off the doorbell entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there for a long time, my ears straining for any other sound. My breathing slowed, but the unease remained, coiling deep in my gut. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to turn away. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, my body still humming with residual adrenaline. I locked my bedroom door behind me. Not that it would do much if someone really wanted to get in, but it made me feel better. Lying back down was impossible. My mind was racing, every shadow in my room suddenly feeling sharper, more menacing. I kept my flashlight clutched in my hand, my ears tuned to the silence. I never heard the doorbell again that night. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself out of bed. My body felt drained, my limbs heavy, my brain sluggish from lack of sleep. I went downstairs, pausing at the front door. It looked the same as always, solid and ordinary. I opened it slowly, the morning air cold against my skin. The porch was empty. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there at all. For a second, I started to doubt myself. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the dream had messed with my head so much that I had woken up still half-trapped in it. Then I saw it, right at the edge of the porch, where the rain had pooled in a shallow dip in the concrete. there was a single set of footprints, bare feet, leading away from my door. I stared at them for a long time, my breath coming slow and shaky. And then I shut the door. I locked it, and I haven't touched that doorbell since. We threw the party at my house on a warm night in late spring, the kind of night where the air feels heavy, but not quite stifling, and the crickets outside hum in steady waves. My house wasn't anything special, just a regular two-story suburban place with beige siding and a backyard big enough for a bonfire. It wasn't my idea to have the party, but my friend was graduating a year early, and everyone said it had to be at my place because my mom was cool about alcohol. I never drank, never even tried it. But it didn't bother me that others did, so long as they didn't act stupid. My mom let me do my own thing, and as long as nobody wrecked the house or needed a hospital visit, she wouldn't care. People showed up in waves. Some parked down the street to keep neighbors from noticing. Others rode with friends and stumbled in through the side gate like they'd been here 100 times. Music played through the Bluetooth speaker on the kitchen counter, and people took turns DJing. Bottles and cans crowded the countertops, some half empty, some tipped over, leaving sticky rings on the wood. Someone pulled out a deck of cards and started a drinking game in the living room. Laughter and conversation blurred into a constant low buzz. I wasn't really in the middle of it. I spent most of my time near the back patio, watching the fire pit glow while my girlfriend stood next to me. It was the first time she'd been over. She wasn't much of a party person either, so after an hour or so of small talk and avoiding the drunkest people, we slipped upstairs to my room. I locked the door behind us. It was quieter up there, but not completely silent. The bass from the speaker downstairs still thudded through the walls, and every so often, I'd hear someone stomping up and down the stairs or a door slamming somewhere in the house. But it felt better, just us away from the chaos. Time blurred after that. I wasn't sure how late it got. Then the pounding on my door started. Loud, frantic banging. The kind that made my stomach drop instantly. Something was wrong. Then the screaming. My friends, 2 of them. Their voices were desperate, shaking, yelling for me to let them in. I rushed to the door and unlocked it. They shoved past me and slammed it shut behind them, fumbling with the lock, twisting it so fast their hands fumbled on the knob. Their faces were pale. I asked what was going on, but they were already talking over each other, frantic, saying that someone, one of the guys at the party, had a knife. That he was saying weird things. That he wasn't himself. The weight of it hit me all at once. Someone at my house had a knife. I locked the door again and stepped back, trying to process it. I pictured the kitchen, the knife block near the sink. It wasn't like we kept anything special in there, just regular kitchen knives, the same set my mom had since I was a kid. But that didn't matter. A knife was a knife. I asked where he was, but my friends didn't know. He had been downstairs, then he wasn't. One of them thought they saw him in the hallway, but nobody was sure. My girlfriend didn't say anything. She just sat on the bed, gripping the sheets in her hands. She looked as freaked out as I felt. Minutes passed. We stood there, listening, but the house had gone eerily quiet. The music was still playing downstairs, but muffled now, like someone had turned it down. No voices, no footsteps, just the occasional creak of the house settling. Then a noise in the hallway. Not footsteps, something softer, almost like a shuffle. A pause, then another shuffle. It stopped right outside my door. I held my breath. Everyone else did too. Nothing happened for a long time. Then a knock. Not like before. No pounding, no screaming. Just a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. I didn't move. The door was locked. It wasn't like he could just walk in. But still, I took a step back, putting myself between my girlfriend and the door. Another knock. The handle rattled. I felt the air shift, the same way it does when someone is standing just on the other side. Then the whisper. I couldn't make out the words. It was quiet, too quiet, but I knew it was him. I could hear the strain in his voice, like he was forcing the words out through clenched teeth. Then the rattling stopped. Silence. I wasn't sure how long we stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. 5 minutes. 10. Maybe longer. Eventually, one of my friends pressed their ear to the door. Nothing. I didn't want to open it, not yet. So we waited. The air felt thick, heavy in my lungs. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. After what felt like forever, I crept toward the door and leaned in, listening. Still nothing. I reached for the handle but hesitated. Then I pressed my palm against the wood, just to see if I could feel movement on the other side. The second my hand touched the door, my stomach flipped. I don't know how to explain it. The air changed. It felt like something was pushing back, not physically, but in a way I could feel deep in my chest, like some part of me was screaming not to open it. I stepped back. Something was wrong. Then footsteps. Fast, retreating down the hall. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We waited another 20 minutes before one of my friends texted someone downstairs. They said the guy had been outside for a while now, just standing by the fire pit, staring at the house. We didn't leave the room until the party started thinning out. Someone had finally convinced him to leave, and I wasn't about to go chasing after him. I never really got an explanation. Later, when we asked him about it, he just said he didn't remember much. Just that he felt weird, that he wasn't himself. He said it was like something was pulling him forward, but every time he got near my room, he physically couldn't step inside, like something was stopping him. That was the part that stuck with me. When we first moved into the house, my mom told me she'd put spells on my door and hers, something to keep out bad energy or whatever. I never thought much of it. It wasn't like I believed in that kind of thing, but he didn't know that. He had no way of knowing, and yet he couldn't step inside. I never talked to him again after that night. I grew up in a region where small towns dotted the landscape between sprawling urban centers. The gang violence in our area was so severe during my high school years that the National Guard had to assist the local police force. If you wanted to enjoy activities like going to the movies or bowling, you often had to venture into neighborhoods where danger lurked, as these venues were situated in less than safe areas. One evening, when the latest Rocky movie had just been released, my two friends and I decided to make the trip to the theater. I was accompanied by my best friend, John, a silent and stoic linebacker who served as the captain of our football team. The other member of our trio was Jack, a humorous guy who loved to have fun, often at others' expense, but was mostly harmless. Jack had a talent for baseball and was on his way to becoming a semi-professional pitcher, a detail that would soon become relevant. After enjoying the movie, we exited the theater and made our way to the parking lot. There, we noticed a car parked near ours that had been utterly vandalized. The vehicle was dented, its windows shattered, and dirt had been shoveled into the driver's seat. A nearby trash can had been emptied onto the roof, and the tires were slashed. Someone had clearly harbored intense anger toward the owner. Atop the car, an oversized 7 to 11 Big Gulp cup stood upright, seemingly mocking the destruction beneath it. Jack, ever the mischievous one, picked up a rock and, standing about 90 feet away, eyed the cup. "Think I can hit that cup off," he mused. John and I immediately discouraged him, urging that we leave the area. We walked to my car, but before we could settle in, Jack came sprinting toward us, urgency etched across his face. "We need to go. Now." Ignoring our advice, Jack had thrown the rock. Whether he hit the cup or not was unclear, but his timing couldn't have been worse. Suddenly, shouts erupted from the direction of the theater. The car's owner had emerged, and from his reaction, it was evident he believed we were responsible for the extensive damage. Given the neighborhood's reputation for swift and violent retribution, we knew we had to leave immediately. I started the car, and we sped off, with Jack laughing nervously, convinced that the owner couldn't pursue us in his trashed vehicle. However, we hadn't anticipated that the owner wasn't alone. 5 minutes into our drive, high beams flashed in my rearview mirror. A car was tailing us. I attempted to evade by turning down a side road adjacent to a gas station, but the pursuing vehicle cut through the station and emerged in front of us, blocking our path. Another car pulled up behind, and I saw doors opening. Panic set in. We were trapped, and the threat of violence loomed large. John and Jack were shouting, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear and adrenaline. John, ever the fighter, was preparing for a confrontation, removing his jewelry and wrapping his chain around his fist. Jack frantically called friends, seeking backup. But all I could think about was escaping. In a split-second decision, I floored the accelerator, maneuvering around the car in front and cutting back through the gas station. We ran a red light, our hearts pounding as we sped away. For a moment, it seemed we had lost them, but soon, the headlights reappeared, gaining on us. Desperation took hold. I drove into familiar territory, navigating dark, winding back roads. Our pursuers, unfamiliar with the area, struggled to keep up. Finally, I spotted a field and decided to make a stand. We pulled over, and as the other car approached, Jack began waving and gesturing toward the empty field, pretending we had backup hidden in the darkness. Miraculously, the ruse worked. Our pursuers hesitated, then retreated, leaving us trembling but safe. That night remains one of the most terrifying and exhilarating experiences of my life. It taught me the value of quick thinking, the importance of knowing when to stand your ground and when to flee, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior in the face of danger. It was a late summer evening when my ex-girlfriend, a few friends, and I were driving back from a weekend getaway. The specifics of our trip elude me now, but the memory of what transpired on our return journey remains vivid. We were cruising along the interstate, about 30 miles from our hometown, when nature called, and we decided to stop at a gas station to use the restrooms. The gas station appeared deserted, its lights off, signaling it was closed for the night. It was situated in a desolate area, surrounded by vast fields and farms, with no other establishments in sight. The nearest exits were at least a mile away in either direction, emphasizing the isolation of the spot. Despite the station's closure, we hoped the external restrooms might still be accessible, so we pulled around to the back of the building to check. As we rounded the corner, our headlights illuminated a solitary figure. A man stood there, seemingly out of place. He wore a respirator mask covering his nose and mouth, and large goggles obscured his eyes. His attire consisted of dirty, tattered clothes, and yellow dishwashing gloves clung to his hands. Beside him was a shopping cart, half filled with indistinguishable items. Notably, there were no vehicles in the lot, raising questions about how he had arrived there. The moment our car came into view, the man's demeanor shifted dramatically. He abandoned his cart and sprinted toward us with alarming speed. Panic surged through me. Without a second thought, I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching against the asphalt, and sped away from the station as quickly as possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and a heavy silence filled the car as we processed the unsettling encounter. The gas station's remote location made the incident even more disturbing. With no visible means of transportation and his bizarre appearance, the man's intentions were unclear, but his aggressive approach left us deeply unnerved. We couldn't fathom why he was there, or why he had reacted so violently to our presence. The encounter felt like a scene from a horror movie, and we were grateful to have escaped without further incident. Months later, my ex-girlfriend recounted another harrowing experience. She had been in Atlanta with her sister and her sister's boyfriend, attending a Braves game. After the game, they accidentally took a wrong turn and found themselves in a notoriously dangerous part of town. As they navigated the unfamiliar streets, they stumbled upon a horrifying scene. A group of individuals viciously attacking a man, using kicks, bats, and other weapons. Terrified, they locked their car doors and remained still, hoping to avoid drawing attention to themselves. The assailants seemed oblivious to their presence, entirely focused on their brutal act. After what felt like an eternity, the attackers dispersed, leaving the victim motionless on the ground. Shaken and in shock, they drove away, grappling with the trauma of witnessing such violence firsthand. These experiences served as stark reminders of the unpredictability and potential dangers that can lurk in unexpected places. They reinforce the importance of vigilance and caution, especially when venturing into unfamiliar or isolated areas. While we may never understand the motives behind these unsettling encounters, they have left an indelible mark on our memories, reminding us of the fragility of safety and the ever-present need to be aware of our surroundings. I got home from class around 5:30 in the evening. August in Pittsburgh was always heavy with heat, the kind that settled on the pavement and radiated up through your shoes, making the whole city feel slow and exhausted. I was living in the North End, up in the hills, in a neighborhood that felt more like a maze of apartment buildings stacked on top of each other, broken up by narrow streets and tight intersections. It was a working-class area, a mix of students, families, and immigrants, the kind of place where people kept to themselves but still recognized each other on the bus, in the corner store, at the laundromat. My apartment was in a large building on a main road that ran straight through the complex, with another road splitting off right in the middle of it, forming a Y-shaped intersection. It wasn't much, just a basic student apartment, but it was enough. I had my own space, a small kitchen where I could practice what I was learning in culinary school, and a bedroom that was mostly just a bed and a desk covered in notebooks and loose sheets of paper scribbled with recipes. That day, like most days, I had plans to meet up with some friends who lived just up the street. It was nothing special, just a casual hangout. I didn't even think twice about it as I locked up my apartment, stepped out the back door, and started walking. The neighborhood was always busy at this time of day. People coming home from work, kids running around, neighbors chatting outside their buildings. But as I walked toward the street, it seemed unusually quiet. I didn't think much of it. I was more focused on getting where I was going. As I rounded the corner to the east side of my building and stepped onto the sidewalk, I noticed a woman walking ahead of me, maybe 20 feet away. I had never spoken to her, but I recognized her. She rode the same bus I took home from school. I had seen her plenty of times, always sitting quietly near the window, watching the city go by. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing that stood out, just another person in the neighborhood, another familiar face in the background of my daily routine. I glanced across the street, saw nothing coming, and took a step off the curb. The sound of screeching tires hit me before I even saw the car. A blur of movement out of the corner of my eye. A rush of air. The deep, sickening roar of an engine being pushed to its limit. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I jumped back, lost my balance, and hit the pavement hard, my hands scraping against the rough asphalt. By the time I looked up, the car had already made impact. It wasn't until I saw the blood that I understood what had happened. It was everywhere, spattered across the wall of the building, pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk, soaking into the front grille of the car that had just slammed into the far side of the intersection. The smell of burnt rubber and something else, something metallic, something wrong, hung in the air. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. My mind refused to piece it together. It felt like I was watching something happening to someone else, like I had stepped out of my own body and was floating above the street, looking down at a scene that made no sense. The driver's side door didn't open. No one got out. It was just me, the car, and the twisted remains of what used to be a person. I didn't even realize I had my phone in my hand until I heard my own voice speaking into it, words spilling out that didn't feel like mine. I was talking to a 911 operator, answering their questions without fully processing them. They asked me if the person was dead. I looked again. The woman, the one I had just seen walking in front of me, was gone. Not just dead, gone. Reduced to something unrecognizable, something that barely resembled a human being. Brains, guts, pieces of bone, all mashed together in the wreckage of metal and concrete. I think I said yes. I think I confirmed it, but I don't remember the words. The police arrived fast, faster than I expected. The moment their cars pulled up, the scene shifted from something out of a nightmare to something clinical. Flashing lights, officers moving in, their voices sharp and controlled. A sheet being pulled over what was left of her. A man being dragged from the driver's seat, his face pale, his hands limp at his sides. I gave my statement, told them everything I saw. It didn't take long. There wasn't much to say. 1 second she was there, the next she wasn't. After that, I left. I don't know why I didn't stick around. Maybe I should have. But what else was there to do? The cops had my name, my number. I had told them everything I knew. There was nothing else I could add, nothing I could change. So I went to my friend's place, sat on their couch, and tried not to think about the fact that if I had taken one more step into that street, it would have been me. I lasted about an hour before I decided I needed to be alone. The weight of everything was pressing down on me, making my skin feel too tight, my thoughts too loud. But when I stepped outside, I saw the entire area around my building was blocked off. Police tape stretched across the street, officers standing guard at every entrance. I couldn't go home. I couldn't even get close. So I turned around, went back inside, and spent the night on my friend's floor. The next morning, I woke up to a phone call from a detective. His voice was calm, professional. He told me they needed me as the main witness in the trial. No one else had seen what I saw. No one else had given as detailed a statement. I was 19. I had no idea what that meant. I said yes without thinking. Not that I would have said no. I didn't know it would take 3 years. I didn't know I would have to fly back to Pittsburgh 5 times, reliving that moment over and over again in a courtroom, watching the man who did it sit there, blank-faced, as lawyers debated his fate. I didn't know I would learn that the woman he killed was his ex-wife, that he had been threatening her ever since their divorce, that their 2 children, young kids, just babies, had been left without a mother because he decided she didn't deserve to live. She was a refugee. She had escaped war, only to be killed on a quiet street in Pittsburgh by a man who was supposed to love her. I still think about it. Sometimes I see her face in my mind, even though I never really knew her. I see her walking ahead of me, just a few feet away. I see the way she moved, the way she carried herself. I see the moment before it happened, frozen in time, trapped in my memory like a photograph that never fades. And I wonder, what if I had called out to her? What if I had stopped to tie my shoe, taken a moment longer before stepping onto the street? Would she have seen the car coming? Would she have had time to run? But that's not how life works. The past doesn't change. It doesn't shift to accommodate regrets. It just sits there fixed and unmoving, a reminder of all the ways things could have been different but weren't. It still makes my heart race when I think about it. It still turns my stomach. And no matter how much time passes, I know it always will. I grew up in a house built in 1809. My parents purchased it after the previous owner, an 89-year-old woman, passed away. The house was undeniably beautiful, with its aged brick facade and tall, narrow windows that whispered tales of centuries past. However, 2 areas always unsettled me: the basement and my bedroom. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, a cozy space with slanted ceilings and a single window overlooking our quiet neighborhood. From a young age, I felt an inexplicable unease there. The closet, in particular, was a source of discomfort. It was perpetually cold, regardless of the season, and often carried the scent of a strong, floral perfume, reminiscent of something an elderly lady might wear. The closet door had a habit of opening and closing on its own. At night, I would sometimes feel the mattress depress, as if someone had sat at the edge of my bed, and I often sensed unseen eyes watching me as I drifted to sleep. As I grew older, other peculiarities emerged. My parents frequently left my brother and me alone, trusting us to be responsible. During these times, I began to notice a distinct smell in certain parts of the house, a scent similar to the perfume in my closet. One particular spot was the window on the staircase landing, which offered a panoramic view of the neighborhood. The aroma would waft around, almost as if someone were moving through the house, and it was always accompanied by an abrupt drop in temperature. Objects would relocate without explanation, and items would vanish, only to reappear in the most unexpected places. The basement was an entirely different ordeal. Typical of old homes, it had a dirt floor and cement walls. The wooden stairs leading down were open-backed, allowing a view beneath each step, a design that always unnerved me. Whenever I had to venture down there, I would either sprint or plead with someone to accompany me. While I can't recall any specific incidents occurring in the basement during my early years, the oppressive atmosphere was enough to instill a deep-seated fear. By the time I turned 14, my parents decided to renovate the basement, transforming it into a new bedroom for me. They believed a change of scenery might help alleviate my growing discomfort with my current room. Initially, the new space felt like an upgrade. It was more spacious, and I had a semblance of independence. But the sense of being watched persisted. I would catch fleeting glimpses of shadows in my peripheral vision, and upon turning, find nothing there. Late at night, a faint tapping would begin on the walls, escalating into a relentless pounding. The sensation of a looming presence became so intense that I struggled to sleep, often lying awake, paralyzed by fear. This constant dread took a toll on my mental health. I spiraled into a deep depression, isolating myself from friends and family, rarely leaving the basement. One winter night, while home alone, I went upstairs to get a glass of water. Our back porch had a glass door that led outside. Due to the cold, condensation had formed on the glass. As I ascended the stairs, I froze in terror. 2 handprints appeared on the door, followed by a breath mark that materialized and then faded away. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move or look away, for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I mustered the courage to run outside and spent the night on the front porch, waiting for my brother to return the next morning. At 15, I seized the opportunity to attend college early, desperate to escape the house. My parents later divorced and sold the property. It was only after the sale that they revealed the previous owner had died in my old bedroom, and her husband had suffered a fatal accident in the basement. He had been notoriously unkind to his wife, a fact that sent chills down my spine. After I left, the paranormal activities escalated, with reports from the new owners of objects being thrown, pictures falling off walls, and that same sickly sweet perfume scent accompanied by cold spots. To this day, I have never returned, and my family avoids discussing those haunting experiences.